Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast. Power 4 conference previews continue. For those folks who didn't tune in last week, encourage you to rate, review, subscribe, and listen to the ACC. But it's all about the Big 12 today, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined, as always, by my esteemed colleagues and co-hosts, Payne Insider and Brad Powers. Gentlemen, hopefully you guys were able to recover with a 7-day break after a 2.5-hour plus marathon. We can only hope to recreate that with 3 power conferences to go.
I think we're going to have marathons. Whenever you have conferences with 16, 18, 20, on the way, 20 teams, tough to not talk at length.
It'd be easier for us if we just break this thing out and have like just the top 60 teams, and then we'll go in alphabetical order and, do like 10 a podcast. But these 17, 18 team conferences are an absolute bear. And now we have the Conference of Chaos.
Well, you mentioned the Conference of Chaos, and I think there are a lot of different dissenting opinions throughout the market in the way these teams have been bet, not only to win the conference, but on their win totals, and we'll allow our listeners, as we always do, to come to their own conclusions as we break down some of the teams that are vying to win this conference for its first iteration under the current landscape. As we know with the Big 12, we're replacing Texas and Oklahoma with former Pac-12 members, Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah, so the road trips will look different. The rivalries will as well, and it'll be interesting to see how all of these teams blend together in a 9-game conference slate. So as we did for the ACC, we'll run these through in alphabetical order, and we'll start with a program that has a new man in charge down in Tucson, the Arizona Wildcats, who see their price to win the Big 12 drifting out from where it opened at 7.5 to 1, now out to 15. Their win total right around 7.5 flat, where it was about 6 weeks ago. We're now seeing that number start to move a little bit. And when we look at Arizona, guys, this is a program that put together one of the best seasons in school history in 2023. They won 10 games, including the Alamo Bowl victory over Oklahoma. And with the bulk of the team expected to return, the sky was potentially going to be the limit. Jedd Fisch takes his talents to Washington. Coach Brennan comes in from San Jose State, and it's now adjusting to life in a new system. One of the more difficult league games, though, for Arizona won't actually count in the conference standings when you're looking at the dynamics in this league. Arizona and Kansas State will play a unique quirk. That's a non-conference game that was scheduled before. So as you assess the prospects to win the conference, use that as a measuring stick, but not as a determining factor. And Brad, when we look at this Arizona team offensively, Dino Babers, the former head coach of Syracuse, takes over as the offensive coordinator. We saw Noah Fifita kind of burst onto the scene last year, perform exceptionally well paired with a high school teammate and Tetro McMillan. You look at the ground game, that was good. A lot of those faces have moved on to greener pastures, but Arizona did a good job replenishing the backfield. More importantly, when we look at the change overall from top to bottom, how difficult is it to assess if a team can build on the momentum of a previous season with a lot of the same players, even if the coaching staff will look significantly different?
Yeah, I mean, if you read the market tea leaves, obviously you got some confliction here. I mean, if you read just your general preseason magazines, they seem to be very excited about Arizona, specifically on the offensive side of the ball, because they got a great 1-2 punch at quarterback and wide receiver in Fifita and McMillan. But you dive in deeper and you look at some of the turnover. There is some pessimism here as far as the turnover. I think any new coaches, I typically want to be a little bit more pessimistic in year one, just because of the roster turnover in today's day and age. And I'm going to be a little pessimistic on this Arizona offense. So I did downgrade them slightly, even though there is some returning production here. 7 returning starters. They're in the top 40 in the country in returning production on the offense side of the ball. And I don't mind the Dino Babers hire. I'm fine with him. In fact, he was the OC here back in the day in the late 90s, arguably their best season in school history. You mentioned last season being one of the best ones. Their best one was probably in 1998. Dino Babers was on the staff at that time. Last year, obviously, was one of the better offenses in the country, number 11 in yards per play, top 20 in yards per game, top 20 in scoring. And obviously, you mentioned the main reason. The offense really got kick-started once Fafita took over at quarterback. And I think most importantly, I mean, you can look at a bunch of the stats that he did and how productive he was in the throw game. But what he did that Jaden DeLora didn't do was he protected the football. If you go back to the Mississippi State game, the reason they lost that game, and we actually found value fading Mississippi State the very next week, was Jaden DeLora didn't take care of the football in that game. That should have been absolutely a win for Arizona. Fafita comes in, starts the rest of the season, only throws 6 interceptions. So as long as he protects the football, then obviously he can carry over that success that he had a year ago. You mentioned the turnover at the running back position. Jonah Coleman, very underrated player. He's off to Washington. Michael Wiley and DJ Williams graded out very well, too, the backup running backs. I will say I really like the transfer portal pickups that they got at running back. Obviously, Brennan coming over from San Jose State brought one of his running backs over, and Conley, productive kid. New Mexico's running back, Krosky Merritt, probably one of the better group of 5 running backs in the country. I mean, those two guys, Conley and Krosky Merritt alone, combined for more than 2,000 rushing yards last year. So I don't think there's a significant downgrade at running back. Where I do think there's going to be a downgrade, obviously the storyline, Tet McMillan, I mean, one of the best wide receivers in the country. I get that. I hear you. But one thing that made him dangerous was they had a really good number 2 and 3 punch at the receiving position last year. Jacob Cowing at wide receiver and Tanner McLaughlin were very viable receiving options for Arizona. So much that both those guys are going to be playing in the NFL this year. They've certainly downgraded. There's some options there, and Malachi Riley and A.J. Jones, who did all right in the spring game when I was watching that. But I certainly think that they've downgraded at the number 2 wide receiver and the tight end position. Offensive line, again, you're going to look on paper and see, hey, 4 starters back. They should be in today's day and age, 4 starters back on the offensive line. That's good. Well, the problem is by far their top offensive lineman, Jordan Morgan, gone. Went in the first round of the draft. And he didn't play. The good thing about bowl games, I know in some instances they're relatively meaningless for that season, but what they are becoming is a preview for the upcoming season. And Morgan didn't play in the bowl game. And I know they beat Oklahoma. You look at the final, hey, they had a great game. Well, I'll tell you what they didn't do. They didn't block up front. I mean, they only had 29 rushing yards in the game, allowed 5 sacks. Worst performance running the football in the entire season. And then it carried over in the spring. I know they were mismatching and missing a few guys up front, but Payne's going to get into it. The defensive line's a big question mark. The defensive line, with a lot less experience coming back, dominated this Arizona offensive line in the spring game. So I'm a little bit concerned even with 4 starters back there. So all in all, look, I mean, there was a 24, 48-hour period when Jed Fish left for Washington, thinking that, I know he probably thought he was taking Fafita and McMillan with him to Washington. The fact that they were able to keep those 2 guys should, at least, keep them from really tanking as far as the win-loss record this season. But I think you got a slight downgrade, Arizona. They certainly do not have the playmakers or the depth as they did a year ago.
Well, Brad, you mentioned the defense and how much different they're going to look. Dwayne Aquina takes over as defensive coordinator. Johnny Nansen off to Texas to work with the linebackers there on Steve Sarkisian's staff. And when you mentioned the front 7, I mean, the conference's leading tackler, Jacob Manu, returns, finished with more than 115 tackles last year. But the defensive line, to your point, will look a lot different. And Payne, we're talking about a D-line that had 10 players log 100-plus snaps last year, only 1 player slated to return. When you begin to assess Arizona on the defensive side of the ball, we know Coach Brennan built up San Jose State over the years, but it didn't happen in year 1. How difficult a transition will Arizona have on this side of the ball, trying to keep up with the high standard they set and the massive improvement we saw last year over year?
I think you guys knocked it out of the park. And if you remember our preview last year, we called for improvement from Arizona's defense because of what they had up front. We got it. And you look at that type of improvement year over year for a program like Arizona, and you think, this is probably not sustainable. They literally went from a bottom 10 defense in the entire country to a top 40 unit last season. It's just not normal level year over year type improvement. So I think we're going to see regression. We did see Brent Brennan when he came over from San Jose State. He kept the defensive minds who he felt were responsible for Arizona's improvement. right? Like you look, he elevated Dwayne Aquina to DC after being the integral part of the pass defense. They elevated Chuck Cecil. D-line loses a lot of talent, like you mentioned. 4 starters. Arizona hit the portal hard. Trey Smith follows Brennan and the new defensive line coach Joe Samala over from San Jose State. Trey was solid last season, 13% pressure rate on pass rush snaps, set the edge at a plus level, was a sure tackler. Then the staff, if you've done some reading, has raved about the UC Davis transfer Chuba Maiua, 350-pound nose tackle who flashed in spring. Kevin Darton transfers in from Syracuse, veteran guy. He was a plus player in the ACC over his 1,300 career snaps there. A couple more veterans were added. You have Stanley Ta'ufo from USC. You have Lane Kennelly from Stanford. Both are replacement level-ish players. Isaiah Johnson returns from injury. They're expecting a tick up from him. Arizona's plan was basically to get as many capable bodies on paper, and then fall camp will kind of figure out the rotation and who can actually contribute at this level. But I do think D-line takes a clear step back. Front 7, though, does return the heart and soul, the captain, in Jacob Manu. He's interesting. I mean, the dude's a fire hydrant. He's like 5'10", 230 pounds. The DC played him very smartly last year, more of a downhill blitzer because he's a liability in coverage. His job basically is to get the defense lined up pre-snap and then stop the run and blitz post-snap. 35 pressures and 7 sacks on 90 pass rush snaps from a middle linebacker is a ginormous number there. You have Traden Stukes at the star position, going to handle coverage responsibilities, just a 66 passer rating allowed when he's the closest defender in coverage. Tay Brown, Justin Flo are in the mix as well. Jesus Christ, Justin Flo. Boy, it feels like this is like his 10th year in college.
I was going to say, I feel like he is logging his 8th to 9th year at minimum, as long as Miami keeps tight ends around.
Yep, and then you have Lavicta Sua, who was the highest-ranked recruit for Arizona in the 23 class. So the linebacker group probably is the strength. Biggest positive on the defensive side, because Brad mentioned being able to keep Fafita and McMillan, it was Takaro Davis. Withdrew his name from the portal. He graded out the 14th best Power 5 corner in the country, allowed 42% of targets to be caught. Maldonado and Johnson are a solid safety tandem. Past those 3, though, you start to worry a little bit. Groves Killebrew at nickel, kind of a fringe top 100 player in 2022, signed with A&M. One and done, no playing time. Transferred to Louisville last season, couldn't get on the field. So Arizona is Killebrew's 3rd school in 3 seasons, and he's expected to start. They went the JUCO route, scooped up Marcus Brown to help in the back end. JUCO guys are come with a lot of variance. So there are some holes on this defense, specifically up front, and if you can't get pressure up front, suddenly, your shutdown corner might not be as good. What's really interesting about assessing Arizona's defense this season is, like, player for player, the defensive line isn't nearly as good, and I worry about the depth in the secondary.
So
the schedule
that's what I was going to ask you. Go ahead.
Yeah, it just, the schedule is interesting. It just doesn't have as many elite names on paper this season compared to last, right? Like, you faced DeBoer and Penix. You got Caleb Williams, Cam Ward, DJU, Shedeur Sanders, a Chip Kelly offense. On paper, it's easier this season, but you do look from like games 3 through 11, Arizona faces an offensive schedule that averages out to be about top 40, so there aren't any weeks off over that stretch. And then 5 of Arizona's games this season are in different time zones. So I think, Brad was kind of hinting a little bit there. There's a reason this win total has been sent down from 8.5 to 8, despite all of, some of the preseason publications that you can find being a little bit higher on Arizona than I think professional bettors are.
And it makes sense why this is a program that came right behind the Kansas States and Utahs in the odds to win the league, and it's a number that's drifted out substantially from where that price was readily available when that market opened up. From Arizona to the Baylor Bears, gentlemen, when we look at Baylor, they are long shots to win the Big 12 under Dave Aranda's leadership. We're talking about a program that was in the 50-1 range. That number floated out north of 60 to 65 in some locations now. As far as the win total is concerned, though, we've seen a little bit of a battle in the market. Some shops were 5.5 under heavily juiced. We're now looking more at 5.5 flat. This is a Bears program that kind of hit rock bottom last year, forcing Dave Aranda to take over as defensive coordinator. You wonder if that's a step in the right direction or an act of desperation for a coach sitting on the hot seat. When we talked about Arizona having a weird non-conference game and coming against Kansas State, Baylor, a similar scenario. They'll play Utah as a return date and as part of a non-conference game against a conference opponent. When we look at the coaching staff for this Baylor program, 5 new coaches coming to Waco to potentially jumpstart the program that fell on hard times a season ago. You do begin to wonder when you're overhauling things that much in one offseason, what that means on field. But Payne, I think when you look at Baylor offensively, they bring in an offensive mind and Jake Spavital that's more than capable of getting things on track. He's a coach that's clearly done a little bit more damage as an offensive coordinator than as a head coach in the past. And most notably, Baylor hit the transfer portal to try and bring in a quarterback from a Group of 5 conference. Daquan Finn expected to be the starting quarterback, although some folks can make the case that Sawyer Robertson might be a better fit. But there are a lot of weapons offensively at the skill positions for Baylor to be excited about. The problem is if this team is going to be successful, they have to have a plan in place to fix an offensive line that was extremely porous last year.
So the first thing that comes to my mind is Dave Aranda, right? I mean, he's got a pretty fiery hot seat there. And then Brad and I were talking last night. He decided to piss off boosters and alumni this offseason, canceling the spring game days before the scheduled spring game. So there's some weirdness here, right? And I think we all like Dave Aranda as a defensive mind, and our belief was after winning the 2021 Sugar Bowl, Baylor could potentially be a force. Since then, though, like you just follow this, and it's like Aranda's been just a giant weirdo. Bizarre press conferences, like nutty interviews, players being outspoken about how much they dislike Aranda. And so he went the route of bringing in the stability you mentioned at the top in what's, a pretty critical season. Gary Patterson joins the staff, and then you mentioned Jake Spavital. And I think that's a guy, if you are buying Baylor, you're effectively buying Spavital, right? He took over a pro-style offense at Cal with very little talent aside from Jay Knott, and in one season completely morphed the scheme and identity, and Cal jumped 40 spots in schedule-adjusted efficiency last year. Spavital's calling this a bear raid offense. So immediately you want to expect up-tempo spread offense with a downhill run game that incorporates Daquan Finn's legs. I would also expect double-digit downfield shots per game, so there was a concerted effort to add speed to the receiver room. Apparently, there's still an air quotes quarterback battle going on, which you hinted at, Todd, between Daquan Finn and Sawyer Robinson. I think it's Daquan Finn's job, but if Sawyer Robinson committed to Mike Leach in Mississippi State before going to Baylor last year, he's been in these air raid systems before, and maybe that's what he's showing well in. When I look at Finn, it's just an elite athletic guy, right? Elite mobility. He evades pressure extremely well, but one thing you notice immediately is he was a risk taker at the lower level of, where he was at. 19 turnover-worthy throws playing MAC competition. I mentioned him being great avoiding sacks when pressure came, but what he wasn't good at was not making some of these head-scratching throws. 34% of the time Finn faced pressure, it resulted in a -1 EPA player worse, so he's got to clean that up. Now, you look at Finn, willing downfield passer, which, again, Spavital wants. In 2022, Finn threw deep on 21% of his attempts. I do wonder a little bit about the accuracy stepping up to the Big 12. He was 80th in adjusted accuracy among all qualifying P5 and G5 quarterbacks against a schedule of defenses last year that had an efficiency rank of 75th, and I was nice in excluding Texas Southern from that data. So I'm interested to kind of see what this looks like at a higher level, because Finn was just so much faster and more athletic than anyone in the MAC, and he could rely on playing backyard football. What's surrounding Daquan Finn is interesting. You mentioned loving the receiver room.
I didn't say I loved it. I said there's experience that's coming back, and there are some pieces to be excited about. Look, you're not having NFL caliber first-round picks out there for Baylor. Don't sugarcoat the way I tried to position it.
They returned the top 5. None were metrically great. You would think the change in system should help because Aranda thinks this is an extremely fast receiver room. You have Monterey Bald when he heads into year 4. Solid slot guy, 2.6 yards per route run last year. Spavital brought in Ashton Hawkins and Jamal Bell. But again, like they were just average-ish players at Texas State and Nevada. Lost their most efficient pass catcher and tight end, Drake Dabney. Replaced him with Michael Trigg. He's like an uber-talented kid, just the light hasn't come on yet at multiple other stops. Offensive line going to be far more experienced. I think you'll see significantly better injury luck there. Guard position looks really good with Gavin Byers returning. Ibedin transfers in from Montana State. Elite player at that level. I'd expect him to be a plus player at the P4 level. I've seen some depth charts that have the 7th-year Ohio transfer Kurt Denneker starting at right guard. That'd be interesting to me. He's had 1+ season of production at a lower level. Caden Siraki moving from guard to tackle. Let's see how he handles that transition, but he was the team's best lineman last season. Alvin Abosele, you have Colton Price. They kind of round out that group. There's far more depth as well along the O-line, but I want to see how this unit shakes out in fall because it's surprising a guy like Campbell Barrington wouldn't be in the starting rotation. Running back room should show better with improved O-line play, the threat of a mobile quarterback. Again, the system should be substantially better. I just don't love like a lot of these guys, though. Like Demonic Richardson hasn't shown much elusiveness in his 4 years at Oklahoma State and Baylor. Bryson Washington is the wild card. He was a true freshman last year, took lots of the first and second team reps this offseason. It just feels like there's a ton of variance with Baylor, right? If Spavital and Finn work, Baylor's going bowling. If there's truly a quarterback battle going on here, and Daquan Finn isn't that dude, like Dave Aranda's going to end up getting fired here.
Well, we'll see if Dave Aranda gets fired. It could be because he hasn't been able to repair a defense, which should normally be his calling card, and you didn't think would fall on hard times the way it did a season ago. But, Brad, when you look at Baylor, they had the conference's worst defense, allowed more than 33 points per game. Run defense finished 115th in the country, 110th in total defense. And when you look at what they have on paper returning, I'm not sure there's that much more reason to be optimistic that suddenly this can be a top 50 unit, but hard to imagine this unit could go from bad to worse year over year with Aranda taking over as DC.
Yeah, I think you said that well. I mean, I have a pretty sizable upgrade as far as the Baylor defense for no other reason that how could it get worse? And obviously you got a lot of returning production coming back, and they filled in nicely with some transfers. But, I mean, let's start with the main storyline, and Payne hit on it at the top. I mean, we got Dave Aranda being the defensive coordinator, going to call the plays. He's also very hands-on, almost like the linebacker position coach. To me, that, reeks of desperation. Big picture. We wonder what's went wrong here the last couple of years. I'll give you one of my theories is Aranda's kind of a unique guy. I don't know if he's head coaching material. The more data we get, definitely more coordinator than head coach. But maybe the guy that was running the day-to-day operation, that guy's at Texas Tech now, Joey McGuire, who was a longtime high school head coach in Texas. And I know people will say, well, that's high school. If you've driven through Texas and seen high-level Texas high school football, there is not that much of a difference between low-level college football and high-level Texas high school football. And I just wonder if a Joey McGuire type was helping him in the day-to-day operation. So I'm actually intrigued to see how this all works out with Dave taking a more hands-on approach on the defense, leaving it up to the offensive coaches. Maybe Patterson's handling some of the other stuff on the outside. So the potential is there for them to be significantly improved, but even if they are significantly improved, we are talking about a defense that was bottom 10 in the country in yards per play allowed, 6.6 yards per play allowed. They didn't do really, there's nothing you could really hang your hat on what they did well last year. You mentioned the total defense, scoring defense. I mean, they couldn't stop the run. They gave up 5 yards per carry. Couldn't generate any pass rush, only 18 sacks. So, yeah, everyone's back, but a lot of these guys didn't grade out that well a year ago. Top 5 tacklers return. Matt Jones is a linebacker that has a ton of experience. Feels like he's playing his 5th or 6th year as a starter at Baylor. I like Caden Jenkins at cornerback, but there's just not a lot of guys that jumped off the page and really jumped off tape at me. In fact, a couple of their best guys as far as how they graded out and were able to generate some pass rush. TJ Franklin and Vaughn said they're gone. They combined for 17 tackles for loss. So I don't know who that name is that immediately comes in and starts putting pressure on quarterbacks. I mentioned some of the transfers that they brought in. They certainly have better depth. The guy that really impressed during the spring was this linebacker, a JUCO kid, and Payne mentioned it with JUCO kids. I mean, if you hit on them like Bill Snyder used to do consistently at Kansas State back in the day, then yeah, you can have a really good program. But a lot of instances, you don't hit on these kids. They seem to think that Keaton Thomas not only is going to be a hit, but maybe their best player overall on defense. At least that's what he was throughout spring. I'll mention this a few times on today's podcast. And I mentioned this last week even, I like using recruiting as reading the tea leaves. Yeah, giving maybe a little bit of a crystal ball, future cast, pun intended there, into the future. This was their this recruiting class coming in, worst in 17 years. To me, that says, yeah, this hot seat is legitimate, and the recruits aren't buying in. If the recruits aren't buying in, be interesting to see if the players on the roster are going to buy into this. I'll tell you one thing I don't like. I don't like the schedule. You mentioned the Utah game being a non-conference game, but let's just, as far as quality of opponent, it could be the best team in the Big 12. So, I mean, basically 10 conference games, 6 of them are on the road. I mean, they had a historically terrible season a year ago. They had 8 home games last year. The schedule, everything was set up for them to make a run last year, and they didn't. I don't think Air Force is an easy game. And if you don't believe me, I mean, they played Air Force in a bowl game a year and a half ago and got dominated in the game. So I see, if everything's a hit and everything works out, yay, like Payne mentioned, they're going to a bowl. But right now on paper, and I've given Baylor the benefit of the doubt, I have upgraded Baylor in my power ratings more than any other team with the exception of one, that being Iowa. And I still only have Baylor favored in 4 games. So I'm a little bit more pessimistic than the market on Baylor.
Brad, my biggest takeaway when you break down some of the X's and O's for a team in the Big 12 on defense, when their best player potentially can be a community college transfer in Keaton Thomas, it's a far cry from some of the difference makers Aranda had at his disposal at various stops along the way, whether it was Wisconsin, LSU, and clearly a program that looks like they need to get to at least 500 if Aranda is going to keep his job going forward. So fascinating program to watch down there along the Brazos that hasn't exactly been electrifying offensively over the last couple of years since Payne mentioned the big win against Ole Miss in the Sugar Bowl.
Not a single blue chip player in the 24 class, not a single one committed currently in the 25 class, to hammer home Brad's point about recruiting there. It's wild to think about.
And not exactly a recipe for success, even in a league that doesn't have an Oklahoma and Texas to contend with when you can't recruit in the state. Brad, the one thing I will say, I mean, once you finish your official FBS tour and you see every stadium, maybe we can look forward to a Brad Powers does high school football in the state of Texas, so you can bounce around from Permian to Midland Lee and some of the power programs of yesteryear.
I did drive tip to tip on Texas 2 years ago. And I was confused in a lot of spots. I'm like, what college is that? And it was high school stadiums, 10, 15,000. And literally on the outside looked better. It looked like better facilities than a lot of the MAC teams that I visited. I can tell you that.
Hey, there's nothing I like more than Texas towns that have high school stadiums that seat 25,000. You look at the population of those towns, they're about 10 to 12,000 in total.
Yeah.
Leads you to believe that they're bringing people in from all over. You mentioned electrifying and some of the things that we've seen in college football. Colorado was no doubt the most polarizing team last year. It was a group that we talked about at great lengths throughout September. I know we faded them quite a few times on this very podcast. And when we look at Colorado, big picture, entering the 2024 season, we've seen their odds dip to win the Big 12 from 40-1, now down to 25-1. Their win total at some shops, 5.5 flat. We're seeing a little bit of juice attached to it as it inches closer to 6. This is a program that lost 8 of its final 9 games last year after starting 3-0 under first-year head coach Deion Sanders. It's a program that hasn't won a bowl game since 2004. They did, however, lose 5 games decided by 7 points or fewer. They were 3-5 in one-score games. But you have to look at turnover luck that was extremely fortuitous in their favor, tied for the 10th fewest in the FBS. Schedule-wise, non-conference, North Dakota State, Nebraska, Colorado State don't give them a true guaranteed win by any stretch of the imagination. Should be interesting to watch there. And Brad, before we get into the offense, curious to get your take on Pat Shurmur and Shedeur Sanders, how they can build on what they didn't show last year once Sean Lewis was fired. You had an interesting tweet about the churn and burn, so to speak, on this Colorado roster about how much they've turned things over through the portal and incoming freshmen.
Well, in the last 18 months, 128 new players have been added to this roster in 18 months. Now, you're going to say, how's that possible? There's only 85 scholarships. That shows you how many guys they brought in even last year have already left the program, whether they were on campus for 3 months, 6 months, less than a year. It's very tough, not only polarizing, obviously, because of Coach Prime, but polarizing in how do you evaluate this team? Because if we're talking about an entirely different roster, not only from 22 to 23, but almost an entire, besides the big names like Shedeur and Travis Hunter, almost an entirely different roster than what we saw even last year. So, I mean, sometimes, uncertainty creates some ability to, if you feel confident enough to price the market better, better price this team than the market. I mean, I have win total bets for and against this team because of the polarization. So as of right now, I'm kind of in a stand pat situation.
So if Colorado is to get bowl eligible and exceed odds makers' expectations, you have to believe it's going to start with the offense. Shedeur Sanders getting all of the buzz, whether it's as a Heisman candidate, you can buy or sell that, but how he projects at the next level. Pat Shurmur, though, for me, Brad, doesn't blow me over with a level of optimism. When you look at a team that couldn't run the football last year, they couldn't protect their quarterback, they flat out couldn't do a lot of things right despite having all of that flash and pizzazz at some of the skill positions, especially at wide receiver. But you look at the starters for this group, I can understand why there's optimism. The depth leaves a little bit to be desired. But when you go through some of these position groups on offense, what do you like about what the Buffaloes have, and where do you have some of the major concerns?
I do have a slight grade on this upgrade on this offense, provided they can stay healthy. That's the big if here. Let's talk, though, where I think there is a downgrade. That's Shurmur calling the plays. Obviously started calling plays in the middle of last season when Lewis was demoted. I don't understand why. I mean, the offense, the first 7 games, 34.5 points per game. Shurmur calling the plays, 19.5 points per game. I wasn't the best math student, but that seems like a downgrade. Now, part of the reason was
that might
lack
get you
of
a
depth.
doctorate at BG in advanced mathematics, Brad. So you never know.
Well,
math checks out there.
Yeah. And if you don't believe me, I mean, I would say of all the things that Deion's done, I think behind closed doors, at least in the coaching circles, a lot of the coaches will tell you they were not a fan of what was done to Sean Lewis. And, Sean Lewis is doing okay. He's got a head job in one of the most beautiful cities in America, San Diego. So I think he'll be just fine. I'm not so sure about this Colorado offense. Let's talk some positives, though. It starts with Shedeur. I mean, with everything, all the social media antics aside, had a good season last year in most metrics. 69% completion rate, 27 touchdowns, really took care of the football, 3 interceptions. He was probably a little bit too careful in the fact that he did play a part in Colorado being, up front, allowing 56 sacks and not being able to run the football because he was holding onto the ball too long and taking, some significant losses. Got to be better up front. I mean, that is the story of this Colorado offense. And obviously, I'll get to all the skill position and the playmakers on the outside. But I think if you believe in Colorado this year, you got to believe in what they brought in the offensive line. Well, you have to believe in it because they don't have anybody coming back from last year's offensive line. 0 starters. Now, positive would be that obviously a lot of those guys didn't grade out that well last year, to say the least. Tyler Brown was a kid that they expected to play and come in and start last year. He didn't get ruled eligible. From what I watched, I don't watch a lot, really zero in on offensive line, but I did in Colorado spring game because of the poor weather, and I liked what I saw from the left guard, Tyler Brown. Seaton, the 5-star true freshman, some people thought, was the number 1 offensive lineman in high school ranks last year. He comes in, already put up, already up over 300 pounds. I mean, that was the question. Can he put enough weight on? Hell, he did that in 3 months' time during the spring. He's got to be pretty functional, and obviously lots have expected him to be a starter as a true freshman. They brought in 5 transfers, and I mentioned some of the grades. Well, okay, the 5 guys last year didn't grade out that well that played the most snaps. A lot of the guys they brought in, they were starters in college football last year. The only guy that really graded out very highly was this UTEP kid at guard. If you look at the other 4 starters that they brought in, did not grade that highly. If you have any semblance of agreement with PFF's offensive line grades, so there's still a question mark. Some of the positives, though, the throwing game. Obviously, you got Jimmy Horn back. Travis Hunter, the question I would have is 452 snaps on offense last year. Is he going to play that many snaps this year? and stay healthy, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that they're going to need him as much because they did go out and get a couple of really good transfers. The guy that I really like is LeJontay Wester from FAU. I thought he was one of the best group of 5 wide receivers in the country last year. I started noticing him in the Clemson game. Obviously, Clemson's got a really good defense. I thought he was one of the best players on the field in the Clemson game last year. He flashed during the spring game. Will Shepard's another kid they bring in from Vanderbilt when he's healthy, very productive player. So there's some pieces to work with there. Tight end's a concern with me. The Smalls kid who originally was a 5-star, went to Washington to play linebacker. They're going to move him to tight end. I mean, that's a big-time unknown. I thought the kid last year, Harrison, was pretty good at tight end early on. He went with Lewis to San Diego State. Dallin Hayden at running back. Like the kid. You can't get any worse as far as the rushing production last year, but I haven't seen him be a bell cow. Obviously he looked okay in spurts at Ohio State, but that's running behind Ohio State's offensive line. That's, with all the skill position talent that Ohio State has and the talent superiority that they have over every opponent. Dallin Hayden's not going to have that fortune this year. So there's certainly some question marks there with the entire running back room transferring out. I thought Dylan Edwards transferring out was a big-time loss for them, not only in the run game but also the receiving game. So on the surface, provided the offensive line's a little bit better than last year, provided in the big if Shedeur Sanders can stay healthy, then I think you got to have a slight upgrade on this Colorado offense.
Defensively, Payne, when you look at the Buffaloes and some of their expectations going into the season, Robert Livingston takes over as defensive coordinator. All signs point to there being a slight scheme change going to the 4-2-5. This was a group that allowed nearly 35 points per game, the third most amongst Power 5 teams, ahead of only Stanford and Vanderbilt last year. They gave up 40-plus in 5 games, 15 games allowing 40-plus points as a program since 2022. It's the most in the FBS. Gave up more than 450 yards per game, bottom 10 nationally. We talk a little bit about what they bring in to try and bolster the offense and mask some of their deficiencies there. This is a defense that's going to look a lot different as well. Optimism with Travis Hunter and what he can do as a lockdown corner on the back end, but there are a lot of position groups, at least for me on paper, that have more questions to answer than answers they can provide going into the season sight unseen.
Dying already. Don't have the sea legs there for 2 podcasts in 2 weeks.
Yeah, I was going to say, we got to build up your stamina a little bit, get you into game shape.
Well, I went to go take a sip of water and swallowed some spit there. I guess this is what I think of Colorado's defense. Not very good. There were 0 redeeming qualities about Colorado's defense last season. If you look, just blanket, finished outside the top 110 in schedule-adjusted efficiency. You mentioned Robert Livingston. Where was he, right? Spent the last 6 seasons as the Bengals safety coach. What I am hearing is they want to implement more 3-3-5. They want to use the strength of the defense, which they believe is the secondary. There's variance with this hire, right? The Bengals secondary did some very intricate things under Lou Anarumo to combat the likes of Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs and a lot of these new age passing attacks in the NFL. How much of that was Livingston? Only a handful of people know the answer to that. And Dion has talked about wanting Livingston to adapt to player strength, something Charles Kelly didn't do. Probably could have told you that before you hired him. It's not just the transition of throwing out players to the wayside. This coaching staff is completely changed. I do think it makes sense to start with the back end with Colorado's defense. They return their top 2 defensive players with Travis Hunter and Shiloh Sanders. Silman Craig, the third piece returning to Colorado's secondary, is nice. The Buffs go out. They add the 4-star Preston Hodge kid from Liberty. Had an elite coverage grade last season. DJ McKinney transfers in from Oklahoma State, only allowed 44% of targets to be caught. The one big change in this secondary, I feel a little vindicated on this. Travis Hunter is moving inside and playing more nickel this season. If you're a loyal listener, that won't be surprising because last preview season we talked about Hunter's shortcomings in the weight room and how receivers at Alcorn State were bullying him on jump balls, and a lot of the Colorado faithful were not happy about those comments. We saw what Stanford's receivers did all night in their improbable comeback. But what Hunter is elite at,
I think Stanford is still playing pitch and catch against Colorado in that second half.
Yes. But if you look at Travis Hunter, his elite trait is being able to move laterally in a blink of an eye, right? Just elite start-stop. So I think moving Hunter to the slot allows him to use that trait and not deal with as many jump balls outside on an island. There's a lot of NFL scouts saying, hey, just focus on receiver, on being a receiver. So that's an interesting take to me. I wouldn't go that far, but I do think moving inside is probably better for Hunter. Defensive line returns its man in the middle with Shane Cokes. Undersized defensive tackle, but seems to hold up well at the point of attack. Good run defender, good tackler. The group should be vastly improved. 9 transfers in. BJ Green, 4-star from ASU, nearly 15% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. I know Kenny Dillingham was not pleased to lose him. Dayon Hayes and Samuel Okunala both come over from Pittsburgh. Hayes was outstanding down the stretch last season, finished with a 16.5% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. Okunala has an abundance of clay to mold. I have no idea if Colorado staff can develop, but I know he was a high priority for Florida State. There's certainly more depth here as well with Amari McNeil returning. He was solid last season. Chidozie Nwankwo, plus player at Houston, former top 150 kid from LSU in the 2022 class with Quincy Wiggins. He transfers in. Rayan Buell was a plus player at Ohio. Keaton Wade, plus player at Kentucky. And then more depth with Anquin Barnes from Alabama and Tareen Carter from Arkansas. Linebacker group is a bit of a question mark. There was a real effort for Deion to try and go steal DJ Lundy from Florida State. Didn't happen. Colorado's moving Trevor Woods from safety to linebacker. Levante Bentley is penciled in as a starter. Massive liability in anything a season ago that wasn't blitzing. You have Arden Walker, showed decently well in limited snaps last season, more of a will linebacker. I think someone that no one's really talking about when the dust settles is the April transfer, Hill Green. He's going to play more snaps than people think. FSU kicked the tires on Hill Green and ultimately passed, but the look was long enough, and Colorado's linebacking group is barren enough for me to think Hill Green contributes more than expected. Colorado's defense will improve this season. I think the question mark becomes how large is the leap, right? Is it enough to result in material change? And I think there's an opportunity to build confidence early with Nebraska's offense potentially starting, most likely starting, right? A true freshman quarterback. You got Colorado State's offense on the schedule. But if you look from like game 4 on, there's really not an incompetent offense that this Colorado defense is going to face. It's a really tough schedule late, especially if Satterfield figures it out at Cincy.
We know the Buffaloes will definitely look to try and garner national headlines. It won't be done at the same clip as what we saw last year, but clearly this is a team that has to get to 6 wins to consider this a semblance of success, and you wonder where Colorado goes once Shedeur Sanders takes his talents to the NFL, how long Deion is destined to hang out in Boulder. You can follow Payne on social media at Payne Insider. You can follow Brad Powers there as well at BradPower7. I'm Todd Fuhrman. Follow me on X, but most importantly, as always, for all things Bet the Board throughout the course of preview season and as we get into the regular season, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And from Boulder, gentlemen, we'll head to Ames, where we see Iowa State's odds to win the Big 12 dipping a bit from 12 to 1, now down to 10. Their win total opened, or at least 6 weeks ago, 7.5, heavily shaded under. That number is trending more towards 7.5 flat. And when we look at Matt Campbell's program, Iowa State is seeking to win its first conference title since 1912, more than 100 years since Iowa State has been able to find glory on the gridiron. The program has, however, had 6 winning seasons over the last 7 years. Schedule always gets defined early in the campaign with their annual showdown against their in-state rivals, the Iowa Hawkeyes, where Iowa State a 2.5-point dog for their trip to Kinnick. 2 of their first 3 league games on the road, but getting Houston early on clearly an advantage. Final 4 games could be a little bit more difficult than they currently look on paper. This team, at least on paper, Payne, returns an awful lot, so there's a reason for optimism. This time last year, it was a program that thought they were going into the year with Hunter Deckers under center. We know about the gambling scandal. Rocco Beck took over, and he exceeded expectations for, I think, what a lot of people thought he was capable of doing in his first trip around. We saw flashes in the ground game from Iowa State down the stretch. There's reason for optimism in the receiver room and an offensive line that brings back some experience. Matt Campbell has oftentimes been lauded for his ability to overachieve as an underdog, but this year a giant target on his back along with the rest of this Iowa State offense.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the betting scandal and the adversity last spring and summer. Lots of sharp money under season wins. Most of us got egg on our face, and You look at Matt Campbell, rallied the guys, won 5 of 7 down the regular season stretch. The 2 losses, Texas and Kansas. So the job Matt Campbell did might have been more impressive than anything he's ever done, and nobody really talked about it at a national level.
It may have stemmed, Payne, from his outburst after losing to the college football juggernaut that is the Ohio Bobcats, and arguably one of the worst college football games that I subjected myself to in its entirety last year.
The positive from the, we'll call it early season turmoil, was finding a quarterback of the future. I mean, you got a freshman in Rocco Becht. Lots to like there. Gets the ball out lightning quick. 2.14 seconds from a clean pocket. Had a 116 rating when kept clean with a big-time throw rate, nearly triple his turnover-worthy throw rate. I think what you're hoping for in Beck's sophomore season is a willingness to be more aggressive. Only threw the ball 10-plus yards 34% of the time, but the deep ball accuracy, to me, suggests he should increase those rates. There's a lot of beat writers talking about Beck limiting turnovers. I just think he was unfortunate. Only 11 turnover-worthy throws all season as a freshman being thrown in the fire. 8 of them just happened to be picked off. A few turned into pick sixes. That's going to regress with any luck. Offensive staff does have a new OC and play caller, Taylor Moser, being promoted. Scheme apparently won't change much, but Moser's calling plays for the very first time, so you're not quite sure what comes with that. Noah Pauley being elevated to pass game coordinator, so some unknowns, right, with that situation. Receiver room, to your point, looks good. I expect Beck to probably throw a little bit more this season. When you look at Iowa State, just in some neutral situations, would think that throw rate ticks up a little bit. Higgins, a big play guy, over 3 yards per route run. Noel, a really nice runner after the catch. Eli Green transfers in from North Dakota State. He was an impact player. Ben Brommer at tight end. You look at him, 6'7", 240 pounds, monster freshman season, can line up anywhere, outside, slot, inline. He's been all the rave during spring, summer. Hopefully he can clean up the drops. Offensive line, to me, is what's going to truly dictate how good Iowa State's offense can be. We've used the term variance with the Big 12, polarizing, right? I think the offensive line group is very much in line with those two describing words. Projections seem to be wide-ranging. All 5 guys return, so immediately that catches your eye. Iowa State goes and adds a Jalen Travis from Princeton at 6'9", 320 pounds, who showed to be an elite pass blocker at that level. You have Gerard Hufford, was the best pass-blocking O-lineman for Iowa State last year. He's moving to center. Metrically, though, the efficiency doesn't match the returning production, and that's kind of what's throwing me off here. I do trust Matt Campbell because he's typically hands-on with the offensive line, but Campbell, inherently wants to run an offense that is run first, and the unit just didn't move anybody last season. A ridiculous 27% of Iowa State's runs were stopped at or behind the line of scrimmage. Offensive line just got zero push. It led to a ton of 3rd and longs, which, not fair to a freshman quarterback, but you look, Iowa State had a 28% success rate on passing downs because they were in so many situations that were not very good for a freshman quarterback. Tyler Miller, Brendan Black, James Neal, they were not good metrically. All 3 are penciled in as starters this season. That trio was multiple tiers below an average starting offensive line. So I want to buy Iowa State's offense because of Rocco Becht, the pass catchers, and then a guy like Abu Sama at running back. Sama, I think, has a potential to be elite if he gets any help from the offensive line. You look at what he did as a freshman, averaged 6.6 yards per rush after first contact, forced 36 missed tackles on 84 carries. How dynamic could he be if his first contact point isn't 0.7 yards downfield like it was a season ago? If you look among 200 qualifying running backs with at least 80 rushing attempts, Sama was number 2 in elusiveness. So I like the weapons. You'd expect growth from Becht. The schedule is downright brutal. Quality of the O-line, new play caller, all of those things give me some pause, but I think this offense has a chance to be far better than some of the mainstream projections out there that have Iowa State's offense in that 60 range. If the O-line improves, the play calling doesn't fall off a cliff, I think Iowa State can have a top 35 type offense. Schedule-wise, right, it sucks. You're at Kinnick Stadium. You're at Utah, which is a tough place to play for anyone, but especially, an unfamiliar team. Kansas State, solid defense. But past those three, there really isn't anything overwhelming about Iowa State's defensive opponents in the other 9 games. Just 4 true road games in total, because Kansas is playing their conference home games at Arrowhead Stadium this season, which is about 85 minutes from the Jayhawk campus. So, again, O-line needs to be better. Play calling, if it doesn't just completely dwindle, I think Iowa State has some potential here.
You mentioned Abu Sama, and while I said that Iowa State, Ohio may have been the worst regular season game I watched, Farmageddon against Kansas State in the snow might have been the most entertaining, and Sama went absolutely nuclear in that contest, 16 carries, 276 yards, and it felt like every time I picked my head up, he was rattling off another 50-yard touchdown en route to putting a triple on the board that evening. Brad, defensively, John Heacock has kind of been the common denominator for what we can come to expect from the Cyclone stop unit. They love to play a 3-man front. Unfortunately for them last year, they couldn't generate a consistent enough pressure when it's tough to replace a talent like Will McDonald, who took his talents to the NFL. But that didn't stop Iowa State from allowing just 12 rushing touchdowns, which is good enough for 14th nationally, holding their opponents to a sub 56% completion percentage, which is inside the top 15, and being outstanding in the red zone as well. With those counting stats in mind, TJ Tampa being drafted into the next level, do we think Iowa State's defense picks up right where they left off, or is the potential for a little bit of a regression in the cards and Ames?
No, I think they pick up where they left off. I mean, for most teams, you would say improvement because of all the returning production that they have coming back. I mean, not in today's day and age of college football, you just don't see many teams with 9 returning starters in the top 10 in the country as far as returning production. You got a lot of continuity. You mentioned Haycock back for his 9th year as a defensive coordinator. Hell, he goes all the way back to Toledo with Matt Campbell. So you know what you're getting out of this Iowa State defense. I think you're getting a solid defense, a good defense. The question is, can they be great? I'm not sure that the personnel there, even with all the experience coming back, I don't see great personnel. And this is in the weeds a little bit, but what's made them, at least, for a lot of the Big 12 offenses tough to deal with was for a lot of the years here, almost the last decade, I mean, they were playing a unique 3-3-5 style of defense that you just didn't see on a week-in and week-out basis. Reality is now, more and more teams are incorporating some 3-3-5 personnel packages. I mean, almost everybody's running some form of a 4-2-5 in college football, even in a lot of the SEC schools. So more teams are familiar in seeing this style of defense. That's why you're not seeing overwhelming numbers in the stat department. As far as the guys coming back, I mean, top 5 tacklers are coming back. A safety, Bo Freiler, was their leader in that department. Kid at linebacker that I really like, a typical Iowa State type kid under Matt Campbell, former walk-on by the name of Caleb Bacon, super productive. Miles Purchase, very productive at cornerback. The guy that really stood out to me on tape, rewatching a few of the games, is a safety, Jeremiah Cooper, 5 picks last year. You did mention a few NFL guys that have left for the NFL here in recent drafts. TJ Tampa, the big loss for them at cornerback, went in the 4th round this past year. Can they replace a guy like that? I'm not so sure. Obviously, this isn't Ohio State where you just replace and roll out another 4- or 5-star kid. You mentioned Will McDonald up front, an elite pass rusher, went in the 1st round, not this past April, but the year before. That was Iowa State's problem last year, just 21 sacks. Most of them they had to generate through blitzes. Can this unit develop any pass rush this year? I think it's a major question mark. They bring in a kid from UL Monroe that's super productive in Snyder, but obviously making a big jump up from the Sun Belt in that regard. The one thing I do like about Iowa State, as far as looking at the schedule, none of the first 4 or 5 opponents would scare me offensively. I mean, obviously a big disparity between facing Iowa's offense compared to Iowa's defense. So we're talking an entirely different perspective. Iowa State's defense should be in good shape against Illinois State, who's not an overwhelming offense at the FCS level. Troy, a lot of turnover. I expect that offense to take a major step back in that game. So Arkansas State, I should have mentioned, is the Sun Belt opponent. Houston, a lot of turnover there. We'll see what Baylor has, but North Dakota doesn't impress me as far as I just noticed I was looking at Iowa's schedule, not Iowa State's. North Dakota, Iowa, Arkansas State, Houston, Baylor. None of those offenses, at least on paper, coming in this year would scare me. So I think there's some ability to have some good production right off the bat. Once you get in the teeth of the Big 12 schedule, though, I don't see this being an elite defense. I just don't. I don't. I'll give Matt Campbell credit. He gets the most out of his players. But what I see is, even with all the returning production, is do these players have a second gear in them? Do they have the old Spinal Tap movie, that ability to go to 11? I don't think so. And we've seen this just a couple years ago. Iowa won the Fiesta Bowl, and they got everybody back, 20 starters back, and everyone, they're in the preseason top 10, and they didn't have that extra gear to kick it up a notch and be a legitimate contender. I have my doubts.
It's good that we're in midseason form as a podcast already, gentlemen, when we're talking about Iowa State in the Big 12, and it's the Iowa offense that's already drawing shade before we get into the Big X preview. Don't tell that to the folks in Iowa City. They're under the assumption, Brad, that Cade McNamara and a change in offensive coordinator after they gave Brian Ferentz's walking papers will allow this team to consistently score 21-plus points against defenses with a pulse. But no doubt Iowa State, a lot of returning production that both you guys highlighted. There's reason for optimism there, but you do wonder about the elite playmakers and with expectations on them and Ames, if they'll be able to live up to those things. As far as the Kansas Jayhawks, when we look at Kansas, we've seen their numbers to win the conference drift out as well, opened right around 6-1 thereabouts. If you shop around 9.5, 10-1, more or less the prevailing price tag now. Their win total has taken some under money as well, 8.5 under, 8.5 heavily juiced under, and this is a program that's building a lot of momentum. Finished last season with their first winning campaign since 2008, seeking their first conference title since 1968. Their streak of 14 straight losing seasons was the worst in the FBS that came to an end. Finished ranked in the AP poll for the first time since 2007. And when we look at Kansas, the 66.2 points per game that have been involved in their football games makes them one of the more exciting teams in college football over the last 2 seasons. It's the 4th highest in the country. You look at the veteran leadership this group has, gives you reason for optimism. But Brad, at the same time, Payne kind of alluded to it, Kansas doesn't have home field advantage to speak of this year. They're going to be playing all of their games either at Sporting KC's facility, or 2 of them, or 4 at Arrowhead. Arrowhead's about 40 miles away from Lawrence. I know there's reason for Kansas fans to be excited. They're ripping down Memorial Stadium. They're building an entertainment district. Great for the future, and Lance Leipold has really rejuvenated this program. But what do you do before we get into the offense to try and adjust the overall power rating and potential home field advantage, knowing that Kansas could be playing in partially empty stadiums when we get into the heart of the regular season?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure that the market fully accounted for it, at least when the win total market was opening up on Kansas, and maybe one of the reasons we've seen a little bit of movement towards the under, despite a lot of bits and pieces coming back for them. A point or so. Keep in mind, for much of the last 10, 15 years, Kansas should be used to this. They didn't have a home field advantage. A lot of games in the Big 12. The opposing fans, outdrew their fans by 2-to-1 ratios. If you're talking when Texas and Oklahoma
the
would
Northwestern of the Big 12 for all of those years when it came to visiting fans invasions.
However, I will say, I've been watching Kansas football the last couple of years. They've had a very renewed, home field, so to speak, advantage. They've had multiple sellouts. You've seen some pretty good Kansas crowds that's played a part in them being an improved program. A point and a half. I don't think you can go any further than that. And I'll be honest with you, I shaded Arrowhead a little bit more, obviously, because just the capacity is that much bigger. Arrowhead got an extra half point in my home field compared to the 2 non-conference games that they're playing at an 18,000-seat soccer stadium against Lindenwood and UNLV.
Yeah, I can't imagine the on-campus contingent is going to make a mass pilgrimage to watch the game against Lindenwood a priority early on in the season. You mentioned Kansas generating home field advantage. Lance Leipold, the reason for that. 15 wins over the last 2 seasons for a program that had just 14 in the previous 8 seasons combined. The worst record in the FBS from 2014 to 2021, going 14-79. You also mentioned the tea leaves and optimism for the program. Kansas's recruiting class in 2024, a lot of reason for them to be excited about the trajectory of where they're going. But Brad, with advancement comes the chance to rebuild as well. And offensively, it may look a little bit different. Jeff Grimes takes over for Andy Kotelnicki as offensive coordinator. And you wonder what kind of adjustments get made there. But I think the biggest question that Kansas fans wish they had an answer to before we even got into fall camp in the first regular season game, how many contests can they count on Jalen Daniels being their starting quarterback? Because he's extremely dynamic when he's out there, but you don't have an accomplished, reliable backup that showed no drop-off in efficiency when Jason Bean assumed the reins, with Daniels missing the majority of the last season's campaign.
Yeah, I think you hit the two major storylines on this side of the ball. The start of offensive coordinator, I think Jeff Grimes is the downgrade from Kotelnicki. I thought Kotelnicki last few years, as far as creative offensive play calling, literally everything under the sun available at his disposal, option principles, spread principles, a dynamic passing attack. I mean, it was some of the best X's and O's that I've seen on the offense side of the ball. And big reason why he left for Penn State. Jeff Grimes, haven't seen that from Baylor the last 3 years. So on the surface, a little bit of a downgrade there. You mentioned the storyline, the question mark, Jalen Daniels. Provided he's healthy, obviously, big question mark because he hasn't proven that the last couple of years. When healthy, he's one of the more dynamic quarterbacks in the country. Even last year in the 3 games that he got in, 75% completion rate, 5-1 ratio. The problem is you don't have Jason Bean to back him up, that like you did the last couple of years, a guy that basically saved Kansas' season last year. And obviously you got a back problem with Jalen Daniels. That was the issue last year. He's had shoulder issues. Those tend to be more recurring than other body parts as far as injuries. So, and if you got a back issue, I don't know if you're running Jalen Daniels or even, entertain the idea of wanting to run him that much with injury concerns. So can Kansas's offense function at 100% when he's not, running like you'd want him to run? I got to question that. Now, I will say the things that I do like. You got to love the skill position, talent, and experience. Running back, Neal and Highshaw are back. They combined for nearly 2,000 yards rushing last year, 24 touchdowns. Neal, when it's all said and done, could be the all-time leading rusher in Kansas football history. Top 3 wide receivers return. Familiar names, Lawrence Arnold, Luke Grimm, Quentin Skinner. Top 3 wide receivers last year. They just so happen to be the top 3 wide receivers in 2022, and they're back for another year. I mean, these guys already have nearly 4,000 career receiving yards in the last 2 years alone. All of them averaged at least 17 yards per catch last year, so all are dynamic. All can, beat you deep, ask UNLV's defense in the bowl game. The question mark, I would say, besides Jalen Daniels' injury history, would be the offensive line. Only 2 starters back. Their best guy at left tackle went in the 3rd round. I do like their replacement, Logan Brown, at left tackle. They seem to be high on him. He's a former 5-star kid that originally went to Wisconsin. They've certainly had to shore it up via transfers on the offensive line. And they were talking a lot about this Tiffin kid from Division II, Tiffin, Ohio kid who won the Remington Award at that level. That's the nation's best offensive lineman at D2. They talked a big game, but yet they went post-spring out and grabbed Texas A&M starting center the last 2 years and Bryce Foster. Actions speak louder than words, so I think there's still some question marks there on the offense, to say the least. You mentioned, though, the recruiting is going well, best class in 13 years. I think the future of the program is great, but I just, they have a relatively easy schedule in the Big 12. I just think the question marks at offensive coordinator, quarterback, and the lack of a home field has me a little bit more pessimistic than the market as far as Kansas right now.
Definitely a lot of things that Kansas will have to contend with. They're able to keep some of the momentum going and bigger expectations on paper than what this program has dealt with over the last couple of seasons. Now, Payne, when we look at Kansas from a stop unit perspective, defensive coordinator Brian Borland's biggest question, does he have enough beef in the trenches? You look at Kansas's projected starting defensive line, not a whole lot in the way of big bodies in that particular regard, but if they're able to try and slow down opposing ground games, there should be reason for optimism when you look at a back 4 that finished second in the league in passing yards allowed last year, market improvement year over year, and you have some headliners in Kobe Bryant and Mello Dotson that give them ultra-reliable cornerbacks. But defensively for Kansas, concerns, questions, or strengths that you're looking at from the defensive side?
Certainly projecting a little bit of a dip because there was a good step forward last season, but you hit it perfectly. The defensive line is the big question. Struggled to stuff runs last year. They were mauled at the point of attack. Only an 11% stuff rate. Didn't create chaos for offenses. Only an 8% defensive line havoc rate. Lance Leipold did an interview last week, though, that was really interesting. He said he's comfortable going 5 deep at defensive tackle with Withers, Dunn, Caldwell, Taylor, and Durrett, who transferred in from North Dakota State. 5 is nice to have. I don't know how many are difference makers. To me, defensive end is the question, creating pressure, making opposing quarterbacks a little bit uncomfortable. Jeremy Robinson returns, played 600 snaps last season. They're relying on him. Had less than a 10% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. He's recovering from a labrum surgery, which kept him out this spring. Dylan Waduki from Youngstown State, stepping up in class, more of an edge setter. Even at the lower levels, 8% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. Dean Miller played 31 snaps in 2 seasons since coming over from the JUCO ranks. Apparently, he's had a great spring. The hope is all the young talent contributes, and this was a little shocking to me, but you guys mentioned those recruiting classes. Kansas has clearly spent some of that budget on edge rushers. You got Bai Jobe, was a top 60 national recruit, number 1 player in the state of Oklahoma last cycle. He transfers in from Michigan State. Deshaun Warner, top 70 true freshman. And then Dakius Brinkley, a 4-star freshman. Let's see if they're able to contribute early, because the upperclassmen haven't shown an ability to get the quarterback, and that's why Kansas struggled mightily last season when teams went up tempo. You couldn't get that negative play to kind of derail the tempo. You just couldn't get a sack. Linebacker room has experience with J.B. Brown. He made a transition from Bowling Green to Kansas last season. Average linebacker, struggled in coverage, allowed 77% of targets to be caught in a 120 passer rating. You have Cornell Wheeler. He's in year 3, but it's his first time as a full-time starter. Jason Gillum played below replacement level over 2 seasons and 450 snaps. So I'm not sure any of the linebackers are premium players, and past the first 3, production could really fall off a cliff, and that's actually important since Brian Borland still plays a traditional 4-3. You mentioned the secondary, Todd. Clear strength of the entire defense. You have Kobe Bryant. You have Mello Dotson at corner. You look at Kobe Bryant, I'm a little surprised he didn't come out. He's improved every single year. Teams just don't throw at him much. Dotson was arguably I would say maybe most important player of the Jayhawks defense. He allowed a 69 passer rating when targeted, which is great since he's seeing more of the action because everyone's going away from Bryant. Marvin Grant was one of the unsung heroes of the Jayhawk defense last season. This will be his 6th season in college. A really sure tackler from the safety position. 6% missed tackle rate. Had his best season in coverage as well. O.J. Burrows rounds out the group with over 3 seasons and 1,500 snaps of experience. From what I see on paper, the question marks with pressure, the struggles to stop the run, I do think, going back to what I said at the top, that the unit takes a tick downwards, especially this, defense takes energy and effort. And so sometimes you're not going to have a downtick offensively because fans aren't in the stands, but defensively you can feed off that energy. And so we mentioned this already, that those conference games are at Arrowhead. It's 50 miles from campus. It's about an 85-minute drive with regular traffic. I think the overall schedule might not be as difficult as the actual schedule of offenses Kansas has to face, but offensive schedule is pretty formidable. Only 2 FBS offenses we're projecting outside the top 65, so there's just not many weeks off when you look at like maybe a respite for the Jayhawks defense week to week.
It's an interesting program because if Jalen Daniels stays healthy for all the points you guys outlined, we know this offense can be explosive even with the downgraded OC, and if the defense gets some contributions, never quite sure what we're going to get from the Kansas stop unit. But I do think watching and monitoring what the attendance figures look like at Arrowhead will be something that could factor in how the Jayhawks handle some of those late season home games that go a long way in terms of determining the Big 12 pecking order. When we talk about the Big 12 pecking order, we can head 100 miles further west in the Sunflower State to Manhattan, Kansas, where the Kansas State Wildcats come in more or less co-favorites, a shade behind the Utah Utes. We've seen Kansas State's odds to win the Big 12 drift out a touch from in that 3-1, 3.5-1 range, closer to 4 at this point. Win total remain largely unchanged, hovering around 9.5, heavily shaded to the under. And when we look at what Chris Kleiman has been able to do in Manhattan, he's put together back-to-back 9-win seasons for the first time as a program since 2011-2012, have the opportunity to be ranked in the preseason AP poll in back-to-back seasons for the first time since the late 90s, seeking their 3rd straight 9-win season for the first time since 1993 to 2000 when they accomplished that feat 8 times. Second most points per game last year, 37.1, and fewest points per game allowed in the Big 12. When you look at the red zone touchdown efficiency, I mean, this was a Kansas State team that got in there and scored at north of a 75% clip and held their opponents below 40%. But Payne, the offense won't have continuity in the coordinator booth. Connor Riley promoted from within after Colin Klein takes his talents down to College Station to join Mike Elko's staff. There is a lot of excitement for Kansas State that Matt Wells could have a unique impact on this offense overall, specifically at the quarterback position along the offensive line, and a talent that electrified in limited usage last year in Avery Johnson taking over as the every down starting quarterback from Will Howard a season ago.
I think you summed that up nicely. Let's move on to the defense.
Perfect. Let's go.
Yeah. I the trust and belief we have in Chris Kleiman's ability, right? And Texas and Oklahoma leaving the Big 12. It's why Kansas State has a win total still at 9.5. And you mentioned them being nearly co-favorites with Utah to win the Big 12, despite replacing offensive coordinator. It's quarterback. 4 starters along the O-line. Some questions at receiver. I've struggled with Kansas State this offseason, and we know how important quarterback play is. Avery Johnson probably determines whether K-State competes for a college football playoff berth or if they barely make a bowl game. And we know he's all the rave, top 100 kid who chose to stay home and go to Kansas State rather than join Mike Norvell in Florida State. He was a huge riser late in that 2023 class, supreme athlete, monster arm. As soon as you watch him play, you just tell he's different. But there's a lot of projecting and hoping the talent and upside shines in a full starting season. Kansas State is the one team I would have loved to have seen a spring game for because, 8 months is an eternity for a young quarterback with all the tools.
There are no dummies there not having a spring game that's widely available and televised if they have some offensive wrinkles.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are some questions from the outside with Avery's accuracy, but in a very small sample, it was similar to Will Howard. So if the floor is the same as Howard, but the ceiling is the moon, right, then this should be a fun season. There's a reason Will Howard transferred out. K-State was ready to move into the Avery Johnson era. But again, right, new OC, you mentioned Connor Riley replacing Colin Klein, then Matt Wells joined the staff from Oklahoma to be co-OC and QB coach. It makes for an interesting dynamic. In front of Avery Johnson is a massive transition, though. 4 starters are gone from an elite unit. When healthy last season, K-State's O-line did a monster job creating running room, protecting Will Howard. You look at K-State, they're going to start Sam Hecht at center. He's played 66 snaps of college football over 2 seasons. So you have that combination of inexperience at both center and quarterback. Hadley Panzer moving to guard, replacement level guy through 1,700 snaps. Taylor Potier has the talent to be the best lineman on the team. Elite level pass blocker in 9 games last year. Staff is really high on him. And this has been his really true first offseason to focus on ball. The last 2 years were spent recovering from ACL tears. Carver Willis plus right tackle. Easton Kilty transfers in from North Dakota State, pencils in at left tackle, was an elite player at the FCS level. So it feels like there's some answers, but that O-line group last year when healthy just really was so damn good. You would project a little bit of a tick downwards. Receiver room has questions as well. K-State is looking for the alpha. You have veterans in Jaden Jackson and Keegan Johnson. Neither are dynamic. Dante Cephas, that is the wild card. Had big years for Kent State in 21 and 22. We heard rumblings, and we did the preview last year for Penn State that he just wasn't fitting in well with the Nittany Lion offense. He transfers out, reunites with his former receiver coach, Matthew Middleton, from Kent State. So you would expect that familiarity to have a little bit of a bounce-back season for Cephas. Then you have the true freshman, Jace Brown. Flashed last year, 2.4 yards per route run. All signs are kind of pointing to him being the guy in this room. Coaches have said Trey Spivey, the fringe 4-star, flashed all spring. But if Cephas returns to his Kent State form, Brown takes that next step, then there really aren't receiver concerns. Run game is where Kansas State has a chance to just be both physical and dynamic. You look at their system, it's designed for runners to get downhill quick. It's really an interesting philosophy, but there's just a ton of variety in that run game. You have the read option with Avery Johnson. You got some counter. You got some gap. And then you pair that +1 with an elite running back room. It's just going to be fun to watch. DJ Giddens He's a horse. I mean, he is a top 10 back in the country. 40 explosive runs last season, forced 69 missed tackles. He can catch the ball out of the backfield, didn't put the ball on the carpet once. You get the 4-star in Dylan Edwards. He returns to the state of Kansas, got a little homesick there, had a solid freshman season at Colorado, especially early on in the year before he kind of lost some confidence. The more I talk about Kansas State's offense out loud, the less concerns I have. And then I look at the schedule, and specific to the defenses that K-State plays this season, there's only one team we're projecting to have a top 35 defense. But again, it all comes down to the young quarterback and hopefully no dip in play calling here.
When we look at Kansas State, Brad, on the other side of the ball, Joe Klanderman's group, from a counting stat standpoint, last year had a very good season. I mean, this was a team that allowed just 21 points per game, second only to Texas in the conference. A lot of returning experience on the two deep, with 5 of their top 6 tacklers expected to return to Manhattan. But I can't help but feel when I watch this team game in, game out, they were prone to giving up the big play. They lack some of those difference makers. So counting stats aside, how are you forecasting Kansas State to look on the defensive side of the ball this season?
I got to tell you, Todd, you were hitting the main talking points on just about all these teams. I couldn't have said it better as far as how I evaluate Kansas State's defense. I guess simply I could say a little bit less questions than the offense, but also less upside. I think you know what you're getting, unlike a box of chocolates with Kansas State's defense. And you mentioned it.
Movie reference.
Yes. I'm going to upgrade it because, again, I mean, in today's day and age of college football, when you return 8 starters, when you're in the top 15 in the country in returning production, you should see a little bit of an upside, especially when you look at some of the basic counting stats. And outside of keeping points down, they weren't overwhelming last year. You mentioned that they allowed some big plays. Yeah, they ranked number 76 in the country in yards per play allowed. Unlike the offense, though, there's some stability on the coaching front. Klanderman's back for his 5th season as a defensive coordinator. The top 2 tacklers are back, one of them being a cornerback that's, in my opinion, never great when when your top tacklers in Siegel. Austin Moore was kind of a revelation, filled in and became one of their more productive defensive players, 12.5 tackles for loss as he gained confidence as the season progressed. They do lose their top 2 pass rushers. Not that they were overwhelming guys, but when they played, Duke and Matlock, you're talking about guys that 10 sacks, 15.5 tackles for loss. They have to, be able to find some guys to replace that. They actually, if you read the coaching comments and what the staff had to say coming out of spring, they like their depth on the defensive line. I can tell you a guy that's got to stand out more is, since they play a 3-man front, the nose guard obviously is ultra important. He stands out, at least physically. Siumalo up front, if you watch tape, 337 pounds. But he's got to be able to play more snaps this year. He's got to be more productive to help out a rush defense. And I bring up the rush defense because you mentioned Sama running in the snow. It wasn't just that game. Their last 3 games, they allowed 242 rushing yards per game. You can't win a lot of games consistently allowing that. So we'll see if they can shore up the defensive front. On the back end, they got some guys that stood out to me. VJ Payne was a guy that, not just because Payne he actually brought the pain. If you watched a couple of his hits in the bowl game, there's some pieces to work with. They kind of remind me of Iowa State. And okay, you know what you're getting on a down in and down out basis. I question there's not a lot of elite playmakers here, but you can win a lot of games with this defense. I just don't know if I can fully count on them. Okay, I'm put my fist in, pound it on the table that this defense is good enough for this team to be a slam dunk. They're going to be in the Big 12 championship game.
It's a fair way to look at it, and I think when you see how the market is pricing Kansas State, you can understand why there is that reason for optimism that this program can get to 10 wins. But when we talk about a relatively high floor, in my opinion, a limited ceiling, as you're assessing what Chris Kleiman will be able to accomplish in terms of potentially getting Kansas State to a conference championship game, giving them an inside track to secure a berth in the newly expanded 12-team college football playoff. To Stillwater we go, gents, for Oklahoma State. And when we look at their odds to win the Big 12, that's a number that's come down a bit in recent weeks, 12, 13 to 1-ish thereabouts, now into the single digits. They've also seen their win total increase by a full game, depending on the shop, as you look around. And this is a program that oftentimes doesn't get the credit it probably deserves for a model of consistency. They've averaged more than 9 wins per season over the last 15 years and have the potential to get even better now in the Big 12 without Texas and Oklahoma. 18 15th straight bowl appearance last year, 18th straight winning season. It's the third longest in college football. Had 17 players that will be in their 6th year, or in the case of Alan Bowman, his 37th year as a starting quarterback potentially on a college campus. When we look at their schedule, the early going isn't easy, but it's also not unmanageable. When we talk about being more than a touchdown favorite against South Dakota State, the gold standard right now in the FCS, a game against an SEC opponent, albeit one that's extremely down in Arkansas. But the bigger storyline that brewed, and I don't think it'll be a storyline when this team gets to fall camp, Brad, was the arrest earlier, or I should say late last week, of their bell cow back, a player that garners all sorts of attention, and rightfully so, knowing he's the returning Doak Walker Award winner.
Yeah, Ollie Gordon. I mean, it was a pretty slow news cycle in college football for felt like most of June, and then July hit, and here we go. 4 or 5 big-time stories here leading up to this podcast this week. Ollie Gordon, obviously driving under the influence and speeding. We'll see if there's a suspension early in the season with regards to him. On paper,
is that local cop not a football fan? What's
he might
going
be an
on
Oklahoma fan, Payne. You never know what you got in that state.
I mean, what's going on there? Drive the kid home, leave the car there, and bring him back in the morning.
Can I ask you guys this? If you're running a college program in today's day and age, how do you not have a car service?
It's a great question, but the better part of that story, I don't know if you guys read it and it's all its details. He got pulled over by a cop who said he smelled a faint odor. He had half-drink bottles of vodka and tequila. Now, I know college kids can do a lot of things, but someone should tell Ollie to stick with one preferred liquor and not have the open container in his car when he's driving home.
Unbelievable.
It's nuts.
Well, let's just, on paper, obviously, we're talking about one of the best running backs in the country. Doak Walker Award aside, this is a guy that was not a feature running back for them the first 3 games of the season. You go back to last season, big-time reason that Oklahoma State struggled was offensive side of the ball. Number one, you had Ollie Gordon only with 19 carries in the first 3 games combined. Obviously became the bell cow down the stretch. Another thing that you mentioned Alan Bowman. They were splitting up the snaps not between 2 quarterbacks, but 3 quarterbacks early in the season. I mean, I guess you know what you're getting with Alan Bowman. I mean, he improved down the stretch, but we're still talking about a guy that threw 15 touchdown passes and 14 interceptions in his 6th year of college football. Is he going to improve significantly in his 7th year? Probably not, but you'd like to see him at least cut down a little bit on the interceptions. I will say he does have some. You got Ollie Gordon, a running back. I think you look at the offensive line, you can't get much more experience than 214 career starts. It's the second most in the history of college football. Dalton Cooper at left tackle and everyone coming back was one of the big reasons why Ollie Gordon decided to come back for this season and didn't entertain the transfer portal because he's running behind one of the more experienced offensive lines in the country. Wide receiver room's in good shape. Presley, Rashad Owens, who really flashed if you watched him down the stretch. Stribling is a guy that they're super high on. Might have been their best wide receiver last year had he not gotten hurt. Gundy says he has all NFL potential for him. So there's a lot of pieces to work with here. I mean, you're talking about 9 returning starters, 90% returning production, number 2 in the country. You look at the offensive coordinator, Casey Dunn, his 5th season. You talked about the consistency that you can rely on Mike Gundy. I mean, he might maybe not be everybody's cup of tea off the field, but my goodness, 18 straight winning seasons of at least 7 games. The only 2 coaches that have won more football games than Mike Gundy since 2007, you might have heard of them, Dabo Swinney and Nick Saban. So, I'll just say, generally speaking, I am a part of the optimism on Oklahoma State. I thought he got the most out of his team last year. I think this year's team's even better. Again, the tea leaves, though. I got to mention some pessimism here. How much is he going to coach? Because, boy, there was if you go after the South Alabama game last year, I thought that might have been it for him last year. I'm wondering if recruits are picking up on it a little bit because – not necessarily for this season, but something concerning for me in the future. Last 2 recruiting classes, their worst ever, back-to-back. So, yeah, I'm buying them as far as this year. But, man, 2025 and beyond, I got some question marks.
You have to try and go to T. Boone Pickens and get him to cut a bigger check from the legacy fund to try and allow these guys to bring in some talent.
You got a shovel? Oh, you can put the legacy fund. I mean, he's a tough
I
ass
don't think
these days.
I don't think T. Boone's cutting the checks himself, but I'm not sure what kind of foundations and everything else he's got from an endowment standpoint. But I do wonder, Brad, you mentioned the recruiting falling off for Oklahoma State. How much of that may have to do with their conference affiliation and Oklahoma kind of using that against them, going, hey, look, our little brother is no longer going to be playing in Bedlam. It's a slightly different conference, so we'll see how that plays out. But Brad mentioned continuity Payne offensively with Casey Dunn being retained as offensive coordinator. They have some of the same thing on the defensive side with Brian Nardo. Now, that may not necessarily be a great thing. When you look at how the defense performed last year, 10th in the Big 12 in points per game allowed, last in yards per game allowed, finished last year 86 in the country in scoring defense, 111th in pass efficiency defense. Pass rush and pass coverage need to be significantly better if this is a group that's going to contend as a bit of a dark horse for a conference title. So when you look at Oklahoma State defensively, can we use the patented Payne line? You can't be terrible, just be average, and all things will work out in Stillwater.
You're doing a good job hitting on these teams this week. I don't know what happened to you, but you got a little burst of energy in you today.
Working on sleep deprivation here, trying to be able to see the forest between the trees.
I think one of the more interesting points Brad made there was about Gundy, because we thought he was dead and buried like 2-3 years ago. And maybe that stuff is what's having the material change on the recruiting trail. So it will be interesting to see long term. Defensively, deep diving Oklahoma State, it kind of solidified my viewpoint that the Big 12 is a muddled mess. There are just so many wide-ranging beliefs for even like the most connected people about this defense that it scares me a little bit. And just on paper, the further Oklahoma State drifts away from the Jim Knowles era, the deeper the defensive regression. Now, Mike Gundy feels differently. He's raved about the depth. He claims there's no weak spots, that this is one of his deepest units that he's ever had. The verdict is still out on Brian Nardo. He didn't have the first season he wanted as Oklahoma State's defensive coordinator. Inconsistent, probably the best describing word for the Pokes defense last season. They struggled to defend explosive passes with that young secondary. They're outside the top 100 there. Struggled defending up-tempo offenses. Situationally, struggled to prevent points once offenses reach their green zone. And, Nardo's 37, so he's kind of learning on the fly. It's his first Power 5 job ever. Part of the, we'll call it inconsistency, was scheme change. If you remember, Derek Mason ran a 4-2-5. Nardo wanted to run his patented 3-3-5 stack. All of the talk this offseason is the Pokes are going with a more traditional 4-down front and will scheme to player strengths than what Nardo's calling card is. It's probably good for the players, but you have this young guy who's still trying to find his way, and now he's calling a defense that isn't what he's kind of built his reputation on. There's a ton of defensive players returning, 10 guys who made at least one start last season. Colin Oliver, he is the horse. He said he likes the new 4-down front. Had 11.5 sacks as a freshman playing defensive line. Did have a 15% pressure rate on pass rush snaps last season. Played a little bit more off the ball. You have Obi Ezigbo transfers in. Played for Nardo at Gannon. Was elite at that level, but this is obviously a massive step up in class. The staff is very high on him. Rest of Oklahoma State's defensive line is interesting. You have Justin Kirkland, made the transition last season from Utah Tech, was a positive player. Just a solid nose tackle at 345 pounds. You have Deshaun Brown, a kid Oklahoma State is relying on to take that next step. Jaleel Johnson as well. Cody Waltersheet is penciled in as a starter. This is his sixth season. Has never played to an average efficiency rating in any prior season. Colin Clay, Xavier Ross, Aiden Kelly, they round out that group. So it's great having 9 guys you feel comfortable with along the D-line. And there's lots of discussion about using more NASCAR package with that versatility. But the D-line is very much dependent on Colin Oliver returning to freshman form, a transfer from Gannon College, making a seamless leap to the P4 level, and then you need both Deshaun Brown and Jaleel Johnson to find new levels to their game that we haven't seen. The depth pieces may have experience, but they're not overly productive. So there's just a lot of variance with this defensive line. Linebacker room looks really strong with Nick Martin returning. You hear the other players talk. Nick Martin's the glue to this defense. He played through a significant wrist injury last season, finally took care of it during spring. Versatile linebacker that gets home when he blitzes, strong tackler, just a solid linebacker. Kendall Daniels has gone from 205 to 240 pounds in transitioning from safety to linebacker. He was a liability in coverage, so this move makes some sense. Needs to improve as a tackler. I would expect the secondary to improve this season. I'm also expecting far more man-to-man coverage and freedom. That's what's being reported by the guys in the Polk secondary. You have Corey Black returns. He's the lead corner. He was the one guy who had a big year in Oklahoma State secondary last year, only allowed 45% of targets to be caught. Cam Smith had a good season as well, didn't allow a touchdown as the closest man in coverage all season. 0 pass interference or holding penalties as well. The other 3 in the secondary are interesting. Trey Rucker, Dylan Smith, Cameron Epps. Epps moved closer to the line of scrimmage last year, more of a nickel cornerish type role. Was a fantastic tackler for his size, 5% missed tackle rate, had 14 havoc plays. Again, everyone inside the program and those covering the team claim Oklahoma State safeties are a strength. The data on Trey Rucker and Dylan Smith say otherwise. You know, Dylan Smith was thrown in the fire as a freshman. Trey Rucker played the most snaps in a season he has in his career, just couldn't handle it. 125 passer rating allowed when closest in coverage. I don't know what to make of this defense. It's very difficult to assess. Schedule-wise, Oklahoma State's defense doesn't play any elite offenses, but they're going to be tested week to week. 8 top 50 offenses according to our projections. But again, there isn't one that you're like, oh my God, this is a clear-cut top 20 offense. I just think there's a lot of variance with this defense. There's a ton of guys returning. There's a scheme shift, though. I don't know. This makes me a little bit nervous, but I would expect a little bit of a tick forward.
Get a pretty good idea of where Oklahoma State will stand and what their realistic expectations can be this season. Maybe not from the primary data point with South Dakota State, although that should be a hell of a game to watch. But looking at them playing Utah and Kansas
It's
State.
not on national. It's not on TV. You got to stream it.
We got to stream it on what, ESPN Plus or the Big 12 network or whatever the hell it's on there, Brad?
Yeah.
Speaking of that, not to get into the weeds, South Dakota State, as good as what we saw last year, I mean, I know what the market says about Oklahoma State, slightly more than a touchdown underdog, but do we expect the Jackrabbits to be able to really push this group?
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be a layup, I'll put it that way. Slightly down for South Dakota State. In the weeds, there was concerns that their quarterback might transfer, so I pounced on Oklahoma State when this line was posted in like April. Not wild about it as much, and obviously we'll see if Ollie Gordon has to, sit out a half or whatever.
What we've seen from Oklahoma State, you guys talked about Coach Gundy. Not afraid to lose to inferior teams as we saw them lay an egg last year against South Alabama. So the potential landmine in the non-conference, a good old sandwich spot with a road trip across the state to Tulsa before their conference opener at home against Utah. So keep that game in mind with a Golden Hurricane program, albeit one that's down, that would love to do nothing more than beat Big Brother if given the opportunity. From Oklahoma State, gentlemen, down to Dallas-Fort Worth, where TCU will look to rebound after what can best be described as a disappointing follow-up to being the runner-up in the national championship against Georgia the year before. They became the first college football playoff second-place finisher to have a season under 500. The next closest team in the college football playoff era was Oregon in 2015, who still finished 5 games above 500. 8th team in the AP poll era to finish with a losing record the year after finishing in the top 2 of the AP poll, the first team since Texas back in 2010. But when we look at TCU, just 4 conference road games, 2 of them, though, however, Kansas and Utah. Utah and TCU have a chance to renew a rivalry that for college football fans out there kind of used to be the gold standard and the annual game to watch in terms of Mountain West bragging rights. They do miss Iowa State, Kansas State, and West Virginia. Sonny Dykes electing to make some changes on his coaching staff. We'll get to that with Brad in a minute in terms of what his expectations are for Andy Avalos taking over for Joe Gillespie. But Payne offensively, this was a TCU team that scored 7.5 points per game more in 2022 than they did last year, but they actually gained more yards last season than they did when they came up short against Georgia in the national championship. The 31.3 points per game were the fewest points per game by a Sonny Dykes coach team since 2018. SMU averaged less than 31 points per contest, and part of that reason was instability at quarterback. And unfortunately for TCU fans, a quarterback position that didn't clear itself up as much as they'd like in the spring, with Josh Hoover, who finished last year missing practice, Ken Seals, the Vanderbilt transfer, and a 4-star, and a name I'm not even going to try and pronounce, Haas Haney, splitting reps throughout the 15-session spring practices.
Yeah, the vibe is that quarterback isn't 100% settled yet, and Josh Hoover didn't win the starting job last year. He just worked his way into that role, and he missed spring with an injury, and then you get a smart kid like Ken Seals transferring in from Vandy, so he picked up Bryle's offense pretty quickly. So this is going to be somewhat of a battle in fall camp with, I think, Hoover having the edge heading in. There really wasn't an area where Hoover wowed me last season. He was just kind of steady, quick release time from a clean pocket, 2.2 seconds. So he was decisive, but he really wasn't threatening from an aggression standpoint, below the national average in percentage of throws at or beyond the sticks. Below the national average in completion percentage over expectation when he actually threw to the sticks or beyond. When he did throw deep, the ball was in harm's way at a ridiculous rate. Hoover had 13% turnover-worthy throw rate on throws 20-plus yards. That was the 13th highest rate among 138 qualifying quarterbacks. So, honestly, macro level, I'm a little surprised when I think of Sonny Dykes, right, respected offensive mind, Kendall Briles, fun college system. You're 16 months from a national title game, and a program that's willing to hit the transfer portal hard, and we're sitting here having a conversation about a 3-star kid in a Vandy transfer battling for a starting quarterback job. That's a little odd to me. Offensive line loses 4 starters, 2 of which were all conference players. From what I see on paper, TCU's offensive line is kind of a hodgepodge of kids that couldn't play at bigger schools or average starters from lesser conferences. I also wonder how long it takes for this group to build cohesion. I mean, I like Bless Harris at left tackle if he can stay healthy. Back-to-back injury-plagued seasons at Florida State, but last season he was an efficiency monster in pass protection, graded out top 20 in pass blocking among 200 qualifiers. FSU couldn't guarantee him a starting job, and TCU could. You have Cade Bennett, been very good his last 1,500 snaps as a pass blocker for San Diego State. Let's see if he can win the left guard job over a returning late-season starter in Colton Deary, who was been below replacement level for 2 seasons. You have Michael Nichols slotted in at right tackle, played more than 100 snaps last season for the first time in 4 seasons and did so below replacement level. You have James Brockmeyer, fringe 4-star kid in the 2021 class, is at center, transfers in from Bama, only played 37 snaps there. I don't get the vibe that he was on the upper echelon spectrum of talent. Carson Bruno transfers in from La Tech. He's in the mix at right guard, replacement level player at the G5 level. Remington Strickland comes over from Texas A&M. 57 snaps in his career there. There's just so many questions up front for me. Running back room has to replace a 1,200-yard rusher in Amani Bailey, who averaged 3.7 yards per rush after first contact and 38 explosive runs. Cam Cook, Trey Sanders, going to attempt to, fill that large void. I'm hearing good things about Cam Cook, and he has the higher ceiling of the 2 backs. We know what Trey is at this point, coming in from Alabama. Just a solid back, nothing less, nothing more. Pass-catching group returns a bunch, so there's depth, but who emerges as the go-to guy? Josh Hoover loses the security blanket and Jared Wiley. The Chiefs drafted him in the 4th round. You would think on paper it's Eric McAllister, the Boise State transfer, but he's learning the new system. Does have a career average of 3.2 yards per route run, finished top 10 in contested catches. You have Savion Williams, solid. J.P. Richardson started last season well, then kind of faded. Averaged 3.3 yards per route run from weeks 1 through 7. So you're hoping that, maybe a little bit more of an offseason in the weight room, he can be a little bit better of a guy sustaining that throughout the course of the year. Veteran guys like JoJo Early, Jack Beach fill out the room. Braylon James, a Round Rock, Texas kid, was a top 150 national player in the 23 class, chose Notre Dame, got homesick. Overarching, there's serious questions for me with TCU's offense. What's the ceiling of the quarterback room, right? If Bless Harris can't stay healthy at left tackle, trouble. Can 5 offensive linemen that have never played a single snap together as one mold quickly enough? Can Cam Cook come close to filling the void at running back? Eric McAllister, can he learn the offense quick enough? The real positive here, aside from a trip to Utah, we're only projecting TCU's offense to face one top 35 defense this season. So if you can kind of get through the early portion of the season, come out the other side with, a little bit more cohesion, then you have a chance here. But, what's interesting is we've seen this market on TCU go from 7 to 7.5. We got there, and there's been some buyback on 7.5. There's clearly been some Stanford money in the market week 1. So it's just a really interesting team with a lot of questions. I'm just shocked these are the types of conversations we're having for a team that's, again, 16 months removed from a national title game.
Well, if there are questions on offense, Payne, I think there are a bevy of questions that the defense is going to have to answer as well with the change in coordinator. The expectation is, Brad, that Andy Avalos will bring a more aggressive approach to defensive philosophy. Early returns from the spring game, somewhat promising as the group moved from a 3-3-5 to a 4-2-5 alignment. 5 returning starters should help make the transition a little bit easier. But you always wonder when you do lose one of your top-rated defenders in Josh Newton to the Cincinnati Bengals. Defensively, from a philosophy standpoint and talent perspective, how do you see TCU rebounding from a lackluster campaign a year ago?
Well, it's tough being worse than what they were a year ago, but I'll echo the sentiments that Payne had on offense. A lot more questions than answers, at least at this point. Now, my thoughts on Avalos, can be an upgrade, I guess, but, we also are talking about a guy that Boise State, got rid of. There's locker room issues at Boise State, and I know if I'm a head coach, I'd be a little leery welcoming a guy like that in my program, especially in today's day and age where I think locker room chemistry is everything. And I got to question the chemistry of this locker room because they bring in a ton of guys with experience. 8 transfers that played 450-plus snaps a year ago come in, along with 6 returning starters. So at least from a quality depth perspective, better than last year. And how could they be worse? You're talking about total defense outside the top 100, number 79 in scoring defense. Not to bring up a sore subject, but literally the day after Thanksgiving was a Black Friday for me. And one of the reasons why it was a Black Friday for me last season was TCU's defense. If you told me pregame, hey, you're going to get out in front of a 3-4 point line move. Hey, TCU's offense is going to score 45 points against Oklahoma. I probably would have bet my truck that they cover, almost 2 touchdown point spread at the time. They couldn't do it. Why? Because the defense was atrocious. Couldn't get consistent pressure all year long. Number 115 in the country in takeaways. Can it be better this year? Well, it should be on paper. The 4-man front is interesting because, obviously there usually is an adjustment period when you're going from 3-man to 4-man fronts. Also not good is you lose arguably your best defensive lineman when you're trying to transfer. You're trying to go from a 3 to 4-man front and you lose your best defensive lineman. And Williams transferred to Oklahoma post-spring. How much in demand was he? Williams might be the most highly paid defensive lineman in college football this year. That's how much he went for in the transfer market. They did bring in a couple of guys that I liked, at least at different levels. Devin Deal was a kid that brought consistent pressure at Tulane. OBAs are arguably one of their better defenders last year. He comes back. You did mention Josh Newton is a big loss on the back end, although, my goodness, Bud Clark's back for another year. He was a guy that stood out even in the 2022 season. 8 transfers they bring in the secondary, and almost all these guys were starters last year. The James kid from Old Dominion was an all-conference performer. Broughton was solid at Utah. Oliver from Tulsa, again, highly productive, and so was Smith from Nevada on defense. So just from a quality depth and guys that have played a lot of snaps at college football, I got to think they'll be better in that regard. Also, hopefully they get a little bit better health. Johnny Hodges, who was a linebacker, started for a couple of years for them, was not healthy last year. He comes back. They do lose Jamoy Hodge, but they fill him nicely with, and yet, tell me if this sounds like a broken record, another transfer that played a lot. Cal's leading tackler, Elarms Orr, comes in at linebacker. So there's a lot of experience here. We'll see how they mesh. You mentioned a lot of optimism for how that defense performed in the spring. To me, I would question, the offense. I think that's more bad offense than good defense, in my opinion. The question mark I have, Payne talked about the schedule. I think it's kind of the opposite as far as, TCU, the offense isn't facing a lot of quality defenses. I think it's the opposite for the defense. Stanford's offense is going to be much improved. And again, we've already seen Stanford money come in. SMU's got a lot of quality pieces on that offense. UCF and Kansas. And in the month of September, obviously UCF and Kansas are more offensive driven than defensive driven. So this new defense is going to get tested early. A slight upgrade for me, but again, like the offense, more questions than answers.
I'm sure there are plenty of Horned Frog faithful just looking for a return to respectability, given the fact that they went from the penthouse to the outhouse more or less in the span of one season. We'll see what Sonny Dykes can do to kind of stabilize the fates and fortunes of this particular program. Now, speaking of programs that would like something to be a little bit more stabilized, I think when you look in West Texas at the Texas Tech Red Raiders, this is a team who saw their odds lengthen a little bit to win the conference from right around 8 or 9 to 1, upwards of 14 or 15 to 1. We've seen their win total come down a little bit in terms of where the juice was allocated on the 7.5. And when we look at the Red Raiders, this is a program notorious for slow starts. They're just 5-5 overall in the first 5 games over the last 2 seasons, just 3-8 in true road games under head coach Joey McGuire. And that is something that has to change this year if some of those Red Raider faithful are going to buy into the program and the trajectory of where they're going. Now, 4 of their 5 games to start the year are all at home. Washington State is the lone road trip, and the first 2 conference home games come against Arizona State and Cincinnati. So maybe the potential to build a little bit of a resume to get things going quickly. People were extremely optimistic about the Joey McGuire hire. You heard how we talked about the potential impact that Baylor could be experiencing without McGuire there to kind of run the program day to day, but the on-field results just haven't been there. And Brad, one of the reasons that Texas Tech has struggled so much in the last couple of seasons, and even longer than that, they just can't seem to keep a starting quarterback healthy. This is a program that hasn't had a season uninterrupted by quarterback injury since 2017. Can Baron Morton be that guy to play 12 full games, or do they have to rein in some of that run-first mentality that we saw for stretches for a guy that was touted for his arm strength and his potential to elevate the position to heights that it hasn't achieved since Patrick Mahomes was back there under center for the Red Raiders?
I think it's still a legitimate question. And if you don't believe me, another spring game was canceled because, Morton wasn't fully healthy in the spring. I guess a significant shoulder injury. Tried to play through it as best as he could last year. But still some concerns there, and probably one of the major reasons why we've seen money come in on the under as far as Texas Tech's win total. I will say, I'll disagree with you a little bit as far as Texas Tech struggling the last couple of years. I get it that they haven't made, especially last season, they didn't, have that uptick in record like they'd hoped, but we're still talking about a program that finally had back-to-back winning conference seasons. They hadn't had a single winning Big 12 conference season since Mike Leach in 2009. That certainly was a major point for Leach, because I tweeted that a couple years ago. Leach retweeted it, that Texas Tech hadn't had a winning season in Big 12 play since he left. But obviously that's been turned around a little bit there under Joey McGuire. Another thing that's been turned around, recruiting. I've talked about a lot of bad recruiting classes. Opposite is true for Texas Tech. They're off their best recruiting class in 13 years. And one of those guys in that recruiting class, at least on the positive side, they got a 5-star true freshman in Micah Hudson, highest rated recruit in the history of Texas Tech football. He comes in, and they're expecting him to contribute immediately. Why? Because the top 3 receivers depart for them. Although I still think that I'm not downgrading the wide receiver position too much. I like Tharp at tight end. Coy Eakin is a big body wide receiver. You got the 5-star true freshman. And particularly one guy that did impress during spring, Josh Kelly, comes in from Washington State. The guy's been everywhere. This is his 3rd different stop, but he has over 2,000 career receiving yards. So that on the surface is a position that you look at their top 3 receivers departing. I think there's an ability to upgrade. I didn't even mention Conyers at tight end from Arizona State is solid. Caleb Douglas, when healthy at Florida, flashed at times. So they'll be okay there. Again, provided Morton's healthy and throwing him the ball consistently. The thing you can hang your hat on offensively is Taj Brooks. I had a super season a year ago, over 1,500 yards, was right there first team all Big 12 alongside Ollie Gordon from Oklahoma State. Kitley's back for year 3 as an offensive coordinator. I could see why more has been expected of them. When you think Texas Tech, immediately you think offense first and foremost the last 2 decades. You don't think number 87th in the country in yards per play. You certainly don't think that. So can they get that, immediately fixed? Looking at the offensive line, maybe no, because only one starter back on the offensive line. Now, I do like what they did in the portal. They went and got a couple of all-conference type selections from smaller schools. The Vinny kid from Toledo, Carter from Memphis are solid, but again, they're stepping up in terms of competition. They got a new offensive line coach that usually takes time to gel. So I guess what I'm getting at is I'm flat as far as the power ratings. It's all going to depend on how healthy Morton is. If he's healthy, I think there's an ability for them to be a little bit improved. But is this going to make you, hark back to those high-flying Texas Tech offenses under Leach? Certainly not.
To your point, Brad, they did finish last season strong, won 4 out of 5 games. You dig a little bit deeper, though, and you look at that 3-game winning streak before they were demolished by Texas, all one-score contests, and anyone who watched that game in its entirety against Kansas wanted to bang their head through the wall, even if Texas Tech was able to get home outright as a 4-point underdog in a game where they just weren't able to find separation. So we'll see if they can use that 34-14 win against Cal in their bowl game to catapult them into a quick start. And Payne, if they're going to do that, Tim DeRuyter's defense will also have to do its fair share to provide a little bit of a stingy stop unit. A ton of turnover on this side of the ball from the previous 2 seasons. When we look at a secondary, that's going to look a lot different. The front 7 as well. Hard to think that this unit can improve with so many fresh faces.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think Tim DeRuyter is a guy that you give the benefit of the doubt to when it comes to running a defense. Just well respected, especially when you think about turning horrific and bad defenses into units that were very, I wouldn't say elite, but certainly formidable, right? Not running 11 Matadors out there like they were before he got there. You look at Texas Tech's defense, they made more than a 30-spot positive leap year over year in schedule-adjusted efficiency. Now, there's still issues, right? Tech got pushed around up front in the ground. They gave up far too many explosive passes. This is year 3 of the system. Just based on talent, I don't know if we see much improvement. But if you're Texas Tech, living in the, top 50 defensively is certainly closer to the upper range of your potential. Specific to the units this year, defensive line, I think, is in desperate search for an edge rusher that can disrupt the quarterback. Out of camp, the talk is Isaac Smith, who had a monster Liberty Bowl, and someone kind of off the national radar is Amir Washington. Both those guys potentially taking that next step. Joseph Adiri and Dylan Spencer are in the mix as well, but there's 0 proven production from that top 4 in terms of pressure. Defensive tackle group has depth, but its best 2 are gone in Tony Bradford and Jalen Hutchings. Tech is going to rely on Quincy Ledet and Banks to make that leap, and then 2 G5 transfers in DeBraylon Carroll from Rice, James Hansen from Nevada. Really like DeBraylon Carroll. Has some juice inside. The staff is really high also on the redshirt freshman Jaden Cofield. And, I mean, DeRuyter expects that kid to contribute, and he's going to be in the rotation. So it'll be interesting. But defensive line has just been, occasionally they have that elite pass rusher, right? We've seen that gets taken early in the draft. But once that guy goes, there's just very difficult times getting pressure on the quarterback. Linebacker group is solid with the tandem of Jacob Rodriguez and Ben Roberts. They play off each other's skill set extremely well. Rodriguez better in coverage. Roberts the better run defender and tackler. You have Taylor Demonson, a 4th-round pick for the Arizona Cardinals. He is leaving a massive hole at Texas Tech star position. He was fantastic last year, 24 havoc plays, allowed a 65 passer rating when closest in coverage, 10% missed tackle rate, which is great for a guy under 200 pounds. So Tech is going from an NFL draft pick at the star position, which is probably the most vital position in Tim DeRuyter's defense, to it being unsettled heading into fall camp. Secondary has C.J. Bakersfield and Braylon Lux back. Those were Tech's 2 top-graded defensive players. Bakersfield only missed 1 tackle all season from the safety position. Lux allowed 46% of targets to be caught when closest in coverage. But what's surrounding those two are young kids that need to step up. Mo Horn, Lewis Chapman have played well in smaller roles, roughly 250 snaps combined for Horn and Chapman. I mentioned the battle at star. That's between McCarty and Jordan. Neither are metrically close to Taylor Demerson. Schedule-wise, the first 5 games, Texas Tech's defense has a chance to be respectable. Final 7 games, there's real potential that Tech has to face offenses that are all in the top 50. So it is imperative that this group figures out its defensive line rotation, builds some confidence early, and hopefully can maintain it to a level where if that offense does see an uptick, as Brad thinks is possible with Barron, then there's some potential here. But this is a team that's been absolutely slaughtered under in the market. Opened 8.5, down to 7.5. We still see respected guys taking the far lesser number. So that's kind of the synopsis of Texas Tech this season.
Yeah, I mean, if Tech doesn't start 4-1 or 5-0, I mean, it could be very difficult for this team to try and exceed odds makers' expectations with that current number sitting at 7.5 and going up to the Palouse even in the spring against a much maligned Washington State program looking for a conference identity. I don't think will be a layup by any stretch of the imagination. From Lubbock to Orlando, Florida, and we'll talk a little bit about UCF and what Gus Malzahn has brewing going on down there. This is a team that's taken money in the market to win the conference. We've seen that number come down from that 12 or 13 range into the single digits. Win total, pretty much 7.5, has remained largely unchanged in that regard. The 6 wins last year were the fewest in a non-COVID season since UCF went 6-7 back in 2016. Schedule theoretically sets up nicely for UCF to build a bit of momentum with 4 winnable games out of the gates. I'm very fascinated to see how their trip to Gainesville goes, a contest that both teams would love to win for in-state bragging rights and coaching job security. When we look at UCF, the 2024 recruiting class was ranked 39th overall, the highest ever finish in the 247 sports era since 2010. Number 2 ranked incoming transfer portal class in the Big 12 behind Colorado per 247 sports. And Payne, offensively, look, we know what Gus is going to bring to the table. And since he took over the program, 5.4 yards per carry, 217 yards per game on the ground, 90 rushing touchdowns. As an offense, 450-plus yards per game, 14th in the country, and 237 plays of 20-plus yards, 6th in the nation during that span. They bring in a transfer quarterback in KJ Jefferson. There are some weapons to like. As far as assessing UCF's offense, do you think they can exceed what they did last year to potentially mask what the defense won't give them?
Well, I'm interested to hear Brad's thoughts on the defense because my guess is he's a touch higher on them than what the output was a season ago. But you mentioned this being a big season for Gus Malzahn. He is taking over play calling duties. So it just gives you the idea that this is a big season for him. Has the new quarterback in KJ Jefferson. And what makes this so interesting for me is, you can listen to some of the old podcasts, right? Or think back to what was discussed. We weren't as high on KJ as market when he was at Arkansas, specifically like when Jefferson was rolling in 21 and 22, and there was a lot of folks projecting KJ in the early rounds of the NFL draft. I never saw that. But after Arkansas kind of petered out and then didn't surround him with enough talent, and he dealt with multiple injuries to both the lower body and the throwing shoulder, now kind of feels like the market has adjusted too far downward on KJ Jefferson, especially being such a great scheme fit on paper in Malzahn's offense. If you get KJ Jefferson returning to the 21 and 22 form, look out, right? KJ Jefferson has always dealt with questions about accuracy, and they're fair, but if you just look at the pure numbers in 2021 among 106 quarterbacks with at least 250 dropbacks, KJ was 12th in adjusted accuracy. In 22, there wasn't a part of the field KJ Jefferson struggled to hit. A minimum 109 passer rating to every part of the field, short, medium, deep. And for a guy that's 6'3", 250 pounds and is mobile and is a +1 in the box, the peak for KJ Jefferson this season is a poor man's Cam Newton. And so that's why I think, we talk about this being the conference of chaos. We've seen under money come in at 8.5, but this is also the team that professional bettors are taking shots on, because if you get the upper end of the spectrum, then there's some real positive that you want to cash in on with futures and the like. I am enamored with UCF's running back room. I think it's the best in the country when you think about both peak and depth. RJ Harvey is a demon, right? Home run threat every time he touches it. 12% of his runs went for 15-plus yards last season. Penny Boone, who we mentioned last week in the ACC preview, averaged 4.3 yards per rush after first contact. He was going to be Louisville's bell cow. He's now going to be in this thunder and lightning role. He was 4th in the country among running backs with at least 150 attempts in yards after first contact. So UCF just has a nice tandem there. Johnny Richardson is still around. I'm shocked. He averaged nearly 6.5 yards a carry as Harvey's backup last season. And then in the portal, UCF adds Miles Montgomery. The volume wasn't there, but he had a running grade in the 90s and averaged over 5 yards per rush after first contact for Cincinnati. This is just a wild running back room. And then you have a mobile quarterback like KJ Jefferson. Offensive line is looking for the right 5, but there's 16 guys in this room. Lots of guys return. UCF hit the transfer portal, and it started recruiting the high school level better. And so that's the interesting mix here is like, are you going veterans? Are you going upside guys? They'll eventually figure it out. We have seen UCF have no issues rotating guys throughout the course of the season. Right tackle has the most uncertainty heading into fall camp. You have Paul Rubelt, has more upside. Wes Dorsey has the experience. Who wins that job? Right tackle's the question mark. You saw UCF try to replace, Tylen Grable. That's a big loss. Amari Kite looks like the horse of the unit at left tackle. He allowed 1 hit on 370 pass block snaps last year. Obviously, having a mobile quarterback helps that. Caden Kittler, the leader for the center job, showed well in limited snaps last season. You have Marcellus Marshall, had nearly 800 snaps at guard last season. Adrian Medley started from week 10 onward last year, only allowed 3 pressures the final 5 games. Receiver room has Kobe Hudson. He's trying to be the alpha. He's your X-type receiver out wide, nearly 21 yards a reception, 2.4 yards per route run. He's going to try to fill that Baker role. Jacoby Jones transfers in from Ohio, had a big 22 season, but dealt with injuries last year. Javarius Johnson transfers in from Auburn. Very efficient player, 3.5 yards per route run. Xavier Townsend returns. And then Gus took a flyer on a familiar name, Ajayi Hall. Former top 50 player in the 21 class, signed with Bama, got in trouble. Transferred to Texas, got in trouble. Now he's less than 2 hours from home. You hope that helps refocus him a little bit. But I think UCF very much has that boom-bust potential. If the offense figures out the right 5 up front, you get KJ Jefferson returning to that 21 form. Gus Malzahn in his bag calling plays in a big year for him. You kind of want to bet on that peak, so to speak. So this is going to be a really interesting offense for me to monitor throughout the course of the season.
You mentioned boomer bust on the offensive side, Payne. Clearly, they have the same capabilities defensively under defensive coordinator Ted Roof's capabilities. And Brad, this was a group that was absolutely porous versus the run last year. They definitely have to improve in that regard, but they were good in the secondary, and it's an age-old question. Is the secondary good because nobody needs to throw on them when you can run it right down their throat? Or is there reason to believe that group was as good as advertised with the number 1 pass defense in the conference, allowed less than 200 yards per game, 6th in scoring defense, 8th in total defense, and they went to the transfer portal to kind of replenish things on that side of the ball. Defensively for UCF, how do you grade this unit heading into the season?
Believe it or not, a slight downgrade on the defense. I got more questions than answers, starting with Ted Roof. I mean, first the question I had to get answered was, how old is Ted Roof? I feel like I've been reading about this guy since I was in high school,
107
which is 20
years old.
I was actually surprised he's only 60. If I would have bet the over on that he was older than that. Certainly, I think he's past his prime. Don't believe me. I think there was one of the anonymous coaches in one of the preseason publications said he's certainly lost his fastball. So that's a buddy hire. Malzahn's worked with Ted Roof before, so I'm not wild about it at this stage. What I certainly wasn't wild about what UCF had on defense a year ago. I mean, number 76 in yards per play, number 83 in yards per game, really got exposed in conference play, allowing nearly 2 touchdowns per more game on average, 123 yards per game more on average in conference play compared to non-conference. You mentioned, some of their struggles. Well, just typically speaking, when you're making the transition from G5 to P5, where do you struggle? Usually in the trenches, particularly on defensive line, number 122 in the country in rush defense. And they had some guys, at least some guys that were productive. So do they have the ability to be better than last year? They certainly brought in a ton of transfers. I mean, to me, they lost a lot of their top guys. Only 4 returning starters. Top 2 tacklers are gone. Jason Johnson was a tackling machine at linebacker. The guy that really stood out to me rewatching film was Morris Brash at edge. 20.5 tackles for loss a year ago. He's gone. Now, a couple guys up front that I do like. I just don't know if they have a lot of quality depth. Lee Hunter, a nose guard, 320 pounds, super disruptive. Ricky Barber, a guy actually played better 2 years ago than he did a year ago. He needs to regain more of his 2022 form at defensive tackle. Malachi Lawrence is a productive player at edge, 7.5 sacks last year, but he's going to see more double teams because Morris Brash isn't on the other side. You like the transfer portal to see, reading the tea leaves, 5 transfers who were starters last year. Pace comes in from Cincinnati, that linebacker nickel type position there, that hybrid. Safety Byron Threats, also a very productive player at Cincinnati a year ago. They bring him in. Ethan Barr was a 3-year starter at Vanderbilt at linebacker. He certainly helps from a quality depth perspective. Tennyson was a solid contributor at Ole Miss. Got out recruited and Ole Miss decided to go in a different direction there. I'd be interested to see if Payne's seen enough from Nigel Kelly, a transfer from Miami. If he can stay healthy, can he be that other edge guy and replace Morris Brash's production? More questions than answers. I will say this: if Ted Roof is a little bit better than what he showed at Oklahoma last year, then the ability's there. But if you're buying UCF this year, I think that the higher ceiling is certainly on the offense side of the ball. I will echo, though, Payne's sentiments. I am clearly one of those guys that saw 8.5, took under, but also can recognize that if the offense is a hit and some of these transfers on defense hit, then a juicy conference outright Big 12 championship was a bet that I also made.
It's like we talk about all the time, and I know folks who are tuning in to our podcast for the first time, they've stayed and listened through the first 2 hours of the show as we go through the conference, talk about these programs that exist, especially in conferences with a lot more uncertainty, the ones that have higher ceilings but potentially lower floors, that while it may seem a little bit unorthodox to bet a team under its win total but bet them to win the conference, if everything clicks, you want to try and get paid for that particular outcome. If everything drops out, there is an avenue where these teams can struggle. So for those folks trying to process why we go about betting things the way we do, I mean, that's the brutal reality of how things work. No different than the way we approach building NASCAR cards on a week-in, week-out basis.
I just think, there's supreme parity in the Big 12, which leads to variance. And I don't really, maybe Brad gets upset here, but he sent over his notes. Teams 1 through 10 in his power ratings are separated by a freaking touchdown on a neutral, right? And so
that's never happened before in any conference.
That's incredible.
The team that simultaneously spams turnover luck, injury luck, and wins the coin flip games will ultimately come out of the other side in this conference. This is the one Power 4 conference where pro bettors are taking their shots because of chaos. And you kind of liken this to other markets, right? Typically the savviest investors make the most money when turmoil hits, right? You think recessions, you think COVID. I just hope the Big 12 figured out its head-scratching tiebreakers, because I think they'll need it this season. It is well within the realm of possibility that a 3-loss team makes the Big 12 title game.
Not only will one of those potential 3-loss teams make the Big 12 title game, you could have a 3-loss team that gets a bye into the college football playoffs Final Four, with the current structure and landscape that's out there. So it's an interesting dynamic and a lot to be gained from winning this particular league, maybe even more so than the ACC, where we think a true frontrunner will emerge, the Big Ten, which we haven't previewed, and the SEC that we'll get to last, which I think sets things up perfectly, guys, for a segue into a team coming into the Big 12 for its first season that is the favorite, at least in the eyes of odds makers, and has seen their price drop from 3.5 to 1 down to 3 to 1 to win the Big 12. That, of course, being the Utah Utes. Win total-wise, 9.5 shaded to the over. We've seen that number take off as well. And last year, they started the season 6-1, lost 4 of the last 6 to end the campaign, mainly because they couldn't score. Won less than 10 games in a non-COVID season for the first time since 2018. They were 7-1 when scoring 20-plus points, 1-4 when scoring less than 20, and all of us stayed glued to our screens early on in the season trying to figure out, will this be the week that Cam Rising makes his season debut? And what we came to find out is that Cam Rising never made his season debut in the 2023 season. They boast one of the best home field advantages, not just in the Big 12 now, but maybe all of college football. There's a program that's 31-2 in their last 33 home games. Their only loss in that span with fans in attendance was a blowout at the hands of the Oregon Ducks last year. Last home loss at home with fans present before that came against Oregon in September of 2018. We did see Utah make some news this week, naming Morgan Scalley the head coach in waiting. I'm sure Brad has plenty of thoughts on that and how well those scenarios have worked out in the past. Given Kyle Whittingham's long tenure, no inkling that he is going to resign anytime in the immediate future. But offensively, Brad, Andy Ludwig, the offensive coordinator that's been there for years, all signs point to Cam Rising returning and being healthy in doing so. I mean, this is a group that if they get all of these playmakers to perform at their highest level with an offensive line that may have some questions, but there are building blocks there, can go out and be one of the better units in the conference, even making the transition to some unfamiliar surroundings.
Yeah, I think it has the ability to be the most improved offense in the country, considering how far they fell last year without Cam Rising. I mean, this was an offense that, number 103 in yards per play, 94 in yards per game, 96 in scoring. Worst numbers here in more than a decade. I mean, literally no pass attack at times. I mean, I looked at numbers back to 1990, could not find a worse year as far as passing the football than Utah had a year ago. But the good news is, Payne and I have mentioned a couple times, hey, I'd like to see a spring game on this team this year with so much uncertainty in this conference. We did have a Utah spring game, and we did see Cam Rising, and what we saw was he looked pretty good, looked healthy, and the pass game particularly looked pretty good for Utah, to say the least, led by Cam Rising. You had Money Parks, Dorian Singer, a transfer from USC. It didn't work out there, but just 2 years ago was an all-conference Pac-12 performer at Arizona. We didn't see Keithy at tight end. He's probably the biggest question mark, for at least for me. Can he regain form? Forget last season. He got hurt in the Florida game 2 seasons ago. I think they got a couple of nice insurance policies at tight end. Carson Ryan, a UCLA transfer. Landon King, a kid that's got a lot of talent from Auburn. I think they'll certainly be okay there at tight end, whether Keithy regains form or not. Another interesting kid to show that I think Utah's kind of going all in this year. Damian Alford was Syracuse's top wide receiver last year. Productive career at Syracuse. Dismissed from this year's team. Utah picked him up in the transfer portal. So I think on paper, a Utah offense that you don't think, screams a lot of playmakers at wide receiver, tight end, and whatnot in the passing game, even with the loss of their top guy, Devon Vele, has the ability to be much better this year. Running back, a little bit of a concern that you lose your top guy in Jaquindon Jackson. The reality is Jalen Glover and Micah Bernard have played a lot of snaps over the last couple of years. Bernard wasn't healthy like it seemed like the entire Utah offense a year ago. He finally is healthy, was in the spring. Another insurance policy, they brought in a 1,000-yard rusher, an FCS transfer from Idaho. Offensive line you mentioned, I see that some might be a little bit down. They lost a couple guys to the draft, but they really like their young tackles. Fano and Lomu are guys that are sophomores, highly rated 4-star kids. I mean, so much so that regardless of position, you're talking about 2 of the top 10 recruits in the history of Utah football. So that's how highly regarded. Big difference between a top 100 4-star and a kid ranked like 380th 4-star. These kids were highly rated 4-stars coming out of high school. So, I mean, again, I think it all comes down to obviously Cam Rising's returning. I saw with my own eyes during the spring game. He looked 100% healthy, and if he is, again, a major upgrade for this Utah offense.
Defensively, Payne, this has kind of been Utah's calling card for years, regardless of what we see from them from an offensive capability standpoint. A lot of starters projected to return from a defense from a 2023 ranking standpoint that was 19th in points per game, 4th in rushing yards per game allowed, 9th in yards per carry, 8th in third down percentage, 13th in total defense. But when you watch them step up in class, it left a little bit to be desired. So when you're going through trying to grade this Utah defense and what you think they're capable of doing, going through the Big 12, which could potentially be a step down from some of the offenses they faced last year, do you think they continue to move forward, or is it a group that stays the same or maybe even takes a step back?
Well, I feel good after hearing Brad's offensive preview because I'm in lockstep with him there. And there were some concerns potentially about Cam Rising being healthy, and I understand, they kind of ran a spring game where you can't touch the quarterback, but he was pushing the ball downfield.
Yeah,
probably the most weapons he's had in his 37 years of college football. The sum defensively always seems greater than the parts under Morgan Scalley, and that's the very reason he was named coach in waiting. There is a guy, by the way, Todd, who was named coach in waiting, who won a national title. His name's Jimbo Fisher, by the way.
What's Jimbo doing now, Payne?
Well, listen.
Other than collecting checks.
Well, the game passed him by a little bit. Let's put it that way. But he was successful. Utah was, a damn good down-to-down defense last season. If you look at some of the metrics, only allowed 36% of plays to grade successful. Certainly starts up front. D-line needs to replace Jonah Ellis. That is understandably, a good-sized loss. Utah's defense would have been better this season if Ellis returned. However, if you're in the NFL, scouts had wildly differing views on Ellis. He was undersized for an edge, then he wouldn't run the 40 to show how fast he was. And if Jonah Ellis returned, the odds of producing 13 sacks again was an absolute long shot since it came on 39 pressures. About an 11% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. And for all our listeners who've heard me reference that number, usually I'm referencing it because a guy's good at 15, 16, 17, 18%. 11% is not an elite number. Ellis also had a 21% missed tackle rate. So those metrics don't typically equate to third-round NFL draft pick, and there was talks that he would have slipped to rounds 5, 6 had his father not had a relationship with John Elway, because his father also played in the Denver Broncos organization. Again, this is a loss for Utah, right? But it's not like North Carolina trying to replace Julius Peppers here. 7 of Utah's top 8 defensive linemen return. They added Paul Fitzgerald post-spring. I think 11 months post-ACL surgery is enough time for Logan Fanu to reach that 4-star status. You have Van Fillinger, who's a solid veteran heading into his senior season. Connor O'Toole really came on late last season after missing the first 6 games. Defensive tackle room is stout. They're deep. It's loaded with vets. It would be great if Junior Tafuna played to the hype. I know he's been won some all-conference awards, but you just look metrically, it just doesn't match. But if he is good, if he is elite, then the ceiling of Utah's tackle room raises. Linebacker group is led by Lander Barton, top 5 highest-rated recruit in Utah history, and he's been as advertised. He also missed time last season. I mean, this was just a team decimated by injury. There's also some tea leaves there, right? Like some of these guys, once they realized their season was a little lost, it's like, hey, let's try to bring these guys back, and next year is our all-in year. Reed is the running mate for Lander Barton. Both do a good job against the run and pass. Maybe some slight concerns about depth past the first 2 since Damanu is out with an injury. They are getting a gentleman back from Mission, who they believe will fill in nicely there. They're closer to that situation than us. They didn't make an addition in the portal, so it tells me they're okay with that third guy returning from Mission. Secondary returns its top corner in Zamiah Vaughn. 29 havoc plays created to only 2 touchdowns surrendered last season. Keenan Johnson transfers in from Georgia Tech, 6-year super senior, but when his role was expanded last year to 500-plus snaps, only allowed 57% of targets to be caught in a 79 passer rating. Smith Snowden, a nickel, is a hometown kid, top 200 player in the 23 class, played over 100 snaps as a true freshman last year because some of those aforementioned injuries. He looked the part. Now he's being elevated to a starting role. The staff loves him. Safety room looks solid. Teo Johnson is a name that some people have probably heard of before. He's a 4-star athlete from the 22 class, made a switch from receiver to safety last season as a redshirt freshman. He was a plus player picking up the position, for the first time. Word is Teo's made massive strides this offseason. You have veteran guys in Gilman and Ritchie that have lots of starting experience at safety. Jonathan Hall is a wild card, played 70 snaps the final 3 games as a true freshman, started the bowl game. What's really interesting about this secondary is a season ago, it had to face 3 of the top 12 picks in the NFL draft at the most premium position in the sport, right? Caleb Williams, Michael Penix, and Bo Nix. They dealt with attrition to the front 7, and somehow it was still a unit that was elite on passing downs, only allowed 23% success rate. Finished top 15 in EPA per drop back allowed. This season, Utah's defense doesn't face the elite QB talent. And from a Big 12 perspective, neither Kansas or Kansas State is on the schedule. So some of those high upside guys like a Jalen Daniels, if he stays healthy, or an Avery Johnson, aren't there. We're also projecting Utah's offense to be superior to last season. And so inherently, that's going to take pressure off the defense. Sure, at Oklahoma State's tough. We'll see what Colorado is. They still feel a little more bark than bite until their offensive tackle situation is solved. UCF is the last game of the season. Is KJ Jefferson going to be healthy by then? Hasn't been healthy the last 2 seasons. A lot of the guys on Utah, right? They took a trip to the swamp in September 2 seasons ago. They're going to be fully acclimated to the humidity, which won't be nearly as hindering in late November. So
especially for a night game, one's currently scheduled for on Black Friday, I believe.
Yep. So this is a really interesting team, and Brad, I think just. We've said a lot of stuff here, but the overarching viewpoint is like they're all in this season. And last year you referenced us is the quarterback going to be back? Is the tight end going to be back? And then finally they got to like week 4, and we didn't say it out loud, but the impression was they're holding these guys back for a run in 2024.
And there's no doubt that they'll have a couple of chances early out of the gates to make sure that everything is firing on all cylinders. Southern Utah, FCS opponent to kick things off. They get Baylor in their own building. They get a Utah State program in a bit of coaching turmoil, given all the developments there with Blake Anderson. And then, to your point, Payne, we'll get their first true test within conference on the road in Stillwater against Oklahoma State. So we'll know exactly what, or at least theoretically, what Cam Rising provides to the offense with his return from injury. One team left to go, guys, in terms of our full-blown deep dives here, and that's the West Virginia Mountaineers, a team that we didn't talk about on last year's preview podcast because there weren't great expectations. We weren't sure if Neil Brown was going to be the head coach heading into the 2024 season. Well, West Virginia went out there and proved all their doubters wrong. Odds to win the Big 12 this season, we've seen this number tick down a touch from right around 20-1 into the high teens. Win total right around that 6.5, shaded to the over. They'll get a home date on national TV, a big noon kickoff against Penn State right out of the gates, where they're a double-digit underdog right now. An outstanding measuring stick to figure out exactly where the Mountaineers will be. When we look at their first 5 games in conference, it'll test them quickly. Kansas, at Oklahoma State, Iowa State, Kansas State, at Arizona. And Neil Brown had some very interesting comments and quotes this offseason talking about a long approach. A lot of the players talked about how some of the more talented individuals weren't always the best teammates, and it created some dissension and whatnot in the locker room. It appears that has largely been weeded out. So, Payne, when we look at this West Virginia offense with offensive coordinator Chad Scott returning his starting quarterback in Garrett Green, who showed his dual threat ability as both a runner and a passer, some running backs that there's reason to be excited about in Jaheim White, C.J. Donaldson, and an offensive line that will show a lot of continuity but down one of their key cogs from a season ago. As far as looking at West Virginia from the offensive side of the ball, where do you think they head in 2024?
Listen, I think you hit it perfectly in that, and I'll probably state it a little harsher. Even if you were the largest West Virginia homer on planet Earth, you didn't see a 9-win season coming.
They told me they would have been thrilled with 6 last year when I talked to folks close to the program, that they just wanted to go bowling.
Yeah, and listen, like some of the preseason publications, we respect more than others, but I mean, odds makers were pegging them for 4.5 wins when, we got closer to first kick there. We didn't deep dive the Mountaineers last year, and we had this kind of just gives you an idea of I don't want to say crazy, but how loving some of our listeners are towards their favorite teams, and that we had a gentleman who was like a staunch supporter of us, listened for decades, commented positively for decades, was not happy that we didn't preview West Virginia. And then when we bet against them one week and they ended up winning, was up our ass 24/7 about it, and we have not heard from him since. So that gives you an idea of how differing some of the viewpoints were on West Virginia last year. But Neil Brown knew his job was in jeopardy, and he put the onus on him, took over the offense, and it clearly worked. So kudos to him. It bought him another season. We'll see what happens this year. Garrett Green was a significant reason why, and certainly has some limitations and holes in his game. But I thought Neil Brown did a masterful job in knowing exactly what some of those limitations were and efficiently schemed around them. So everything was geared towards Green's strengths, right? It was either a short throw quickly, it was a deep bomb, and if neither are there, go be an athlete with your legs. And that's exactly how the offense was run. And Green also did a great job taking care of the ball. 1% turnover-worthy throw rate from a clean pocket. The deep stuff was cooking. 25% of Garrett Green's throws were deep. He was 16th in adjusted accuracy on those throws out of 142 qualifying quarterbacks. Green had the highest rate of throws at or beyond the sticks in college football. There were only 2 Power 5 quarterbacks that threw deep at least 20% of the time, while also having an adjusted accuracy rate of 50% or greater. It was Jalen Milroe, and it was Garrett Green. Only Heisman winner Jaden Daniels had a better rushing grade than Garrett Green among qualifying quarterbacks. So he was fantastic last year. I mean, he was in a quarterback battle in spring with Nico Markiel. So it was just wild to see how that unfolded.
Nico flashed. Nico got his opportunity when Garrett was dinged up, and Nico did not impress when Nico was out there.
Florida State stopped recruiting him. He was like the early kid in the class. We're gonna take the kid as a high floor guy, and then they recruited over him, and that's why he ended up signing with West Virginia. Another group that exceeded expectation was West Virginia's offensive line. They were elite, to your point. When you look at line yards created and an ability for guys to get to the second level, you can see why West Virginia finished top 20 in EPA per rush. It also helps, again, when you have a mobile quarterback, a little bit of a cheat code there. The unit does lose 2 of its horses. Zach Frazier was one of the country's best centers, good run blocker, elite pass protector, only allowed 6 pressures on 359 pass blocking snaps. He was the 51st pick in the NFL draft. Right tackle Doug Nestor is gone. He allowed 6 pressures the final 8 games. I still like what returns this season. Left tackle Wyatt Millum is elite, hasn't allowed a sack in 2 seasons, can move people in the run game. Brandon Yates moves to center. Good pass blocker last season, versatile, played all 3 positions. Thomas Rimmick allowed his QB to be hit once all season. You have Jaquay Hubbard played over 400 snaps last season, 4 pressures allowed. Nick Malone played over 400 snaps last season, only 4 pressures allowed. He looks like the guy at right tackle. You have Xavier Bosley transfers in from Jacksonville State, 900 snap guy. He either wins the starting right tackle job or he becomes premium depth. Typically, when a program like West Virginia loses 2 horses, like a Frazier and a Nestor, you're projecting a massive dip. I think West Virginia still has a plus offensive line this season. Weapons are the question. Receiver room is desperately searching for an alpha. Traylon Ray is a kid Mike Norvell recruited briefly, being from Tallahassee. FSU passed, had a really nice end to his true freshman year. 2.5 yards per route run the final 5 games. Jaden Bray is interesting. Transfers in from Oklahoma State. He had dealt with numerous thumb injuries, broke his left thumb specifically 3 times while at OK State, was thought to be battling for the wide receiver 1 job for the Pokes. Last camp, showed well early in the season as an ex-receiver. I think Bray has more juice than what he's shown so far. Cole Taylor at tight end I like, led the team in receiving touchdowns. Let's see if Green uses the parts of the field that Cole Taylor likes to operate in more. Rodney Gallagher, a 4-star freshman last season, the staff is high on him. West Virginia took a flyer on Justin Robinson, a big 6'4" kid who was at Georgia for a while. You mentioned at the top Jaheim White and C.J. Donaldson might be one of the more unheralded running back duos in the country. But by far the biggest question is schedule. From a team perspective, though, it's far more difficult than through the offensive lens. If you look, West Virginia faces 3 of her top 30 projected defenses, and aside from Albany, not a single defense we have projected outside our top 80. So there are no layups here for West Virginia, and I think that's the big question mark. We've still seen over money come into the market here, but I think this had the potential, if the schedule was softer, that this could have been a West Virginia team that potentially made some noise. Very interested to hear what Brad has to say about the defense, though.
Well, you mentioned that defense, and Brad, when we look at Jordan Leslie, what he's going to be tasked with, it's a group that finished last season in the top half of the conference for both points and yards allowed per game. Depth was a legitimate concern. From a front seven standpoint, there are some starters to be excited about. From a back four side, there are some playmakers there as well. But when you look at West Virginia defensively this year, can they make a leap forward, or are there more questions that still have to be answered in Mountaineer country?
Yeah, more questions than answers. First, I will say Leslie did a good job last year. It was certainly a much improved defense from what they were in 2022, although certainly, in my opinion, do not have the same high ceiling that the offense does. I'll just start with basic returning production. Not really there, 86 in the country on this side of the ball. And comparatively speaking, and we're talking about a Big 12 conference on average returns more production than any other conference in college football. So they don't have a lot of guys coming back. Some of the losses are significant. Beanie Bishop was a first-team All-American, according to some services. I mean, nobody had more passes defensed in all of Power 5 college football than Beanie Bishop. Leading tackler departs. Top 3 pass rushers all transferred out. So there's some big-time concerns here. Now, I do like some of the guys coming back. I'll start up front. Sean Martin at defensive end really stands out. He's a guy that's been productive the last couple of years. Has that prototypical size that you want at defensive end. Another guy off the edge that started flashing in the bowl game, Bradley, big bowl game production out of him. Can he be that go-to guy that can generate pressure on the quarterback? And the back end of the defense, Aubrey Burks, was playing more in the secondary last year. He's going to walk up closer to the line of scrimmage this year and play the spear position. Highly productive player, but obviously a lot more going to be on his plate than last year. They bring in some transfers, to say the least. Up front, T.J. Jackson from Troy, guy that's 22.5 tackles for loss in his career. I like a couple of linebackers that we didn't see on West Virginia's team last season. Ty French comes in from Gardner-Webb. Josiah Trotter wasn't healthy last year. 2 guys that they're very high on. 2 more guys that they're high on. Again, transfers weren't on this West Virginia defense a year ago. They're both from Northwestern. Garnett Hollis and Jaheim Joseph. If you look at Northwestern's very underrated defense of a year ago, these are 2 of their 4 highest graded guys on that defense. So some big pickups there. I just, when you factor in that they lose, a team that doesn't have a lot of alphas, and if you're looking at, the guys that were super productive a year ago, they lose almost all those guys, and then you factor that in to a schedule that of the, Payne mentioned I got 10 teams power rated within a touchdown of one another. West Virginia is certainly in that top 10 mix there as far as contenders in the Big 12. The schedule doesn't lead them to being a Big 12 contender, in my opinion. Top 10 schedule nationally in terms of difficulty. I mean, it starts right off the bat with Penn State. They got an improved Pitt offense on the road. Kansas is also there in September. I just think that, the quality depth isn't there for me to be super confident about West Virginia's defense.
Brad, you mentioned that season opener against Penn State, and I know West Virginia fans have that game circled on their calendar. They think it's a chance for them to go out there and pull off a pretty impressive upset if they're able to do so in front of a national TV audience to start things, a game that we'll get to in greater detail as the season approaches. But what is your initial feeling in terms of what you'd be looking for from West Virginia in a game like that, irregardless of point spread, in terms of a position group that you'd want to see go out there and be able to hold their own?
Well, for me, It'd be the offensive line, honestly, on the other side of the ball. I hate to go to that side, but, do they have those quality replacements like Payne mentioned against, obviously Penn State's strength is going to be up front on defense. So if they can hold their own up front on the offensive line early on, then they can have some success in that game. I think the defensively, what Penn State's got a new offensive coordinator. Not the quarterback, to me, left a little bit to be desired. Running game took a step back for Penn State a year ago. I think the defense, even though I have some question marks, can keep them in the game. I'm not expecting a win, but I'll just say this: anything above 10. I would be more on the dog side of things there.
One of the more fascinating games, no doubt, week 1 for a Big 12 opponent. We mentioned Oklahoma State playing host to South Dakota State, and some of the other games that we'll have our eyes on in this league. But one other team I want to get to, guys, briefly, and we won't get to some of the other programs. So if you're a Houston fan, a BYU fan, an Arizona State fan, and you've been listening...
We'll get to one of those later on as well.
For 2.5 hours plus, you won't get the deep dive there. But the Cincinnati Bearcats, Brad, we've seen a little bit of back and forth in terms of their win total in the betting market. You look at their schedule early on, it appears they'll have an opportunity to get a couple of those wins to maybe get them closer to bowl eligibility. We know Coach Satterfield can be rather polarizing, and if he is the coach to fill the shoes of Luke Fickell and return this program to a level of respectability. Offensively, you bring in a new quarterback in Brandon Sorsby, competing with Brady Lichtenberg for the starting quarterback job, but all signs point to Sorsby getting that. And he'll lead an offense that was extremely good when it came to running the football. They just really couldn't do much of anything else, but there was a big concern injury-wise that I think Cincinnati is going to have to deal with. News broke last Friday. Dante Corleone dealing with blood clots in his lungs. You hope that he's okay first and foremost, but from a football standpoint, Brad, when you look at Cincinnati this season, what do you make of the ongoing battle in terms of the Bearcats win total in the market?
Yeah, I think it's the ongoing battle that we're going to see a lot in the future here, because it's a team that's going to be boom or bust, not only in this conference, but boom or bust because they're going to rely so heavily on the transfer portal. Obviously, we saw a ton of regression last year from Cincinnati, what they've been the last 4 or 5 years under Fickell. I have more questions than answers because I saw a program in Cincinnati hired Satterfield, took a major step back. I saw the program that Satterfield left, Louisville, take a major step up. So to me, that gives me a little bit more pessimism. I see why some people are high. I mean, all 5 starters back on the offensive line, that already was their strength of their team last year. The run game should be super solid. I think they probably upgraded a quarterback with Sorsby coming over from Indiana. But man, if there was a guy that was the alpha on their team, by far their best player on the team last year was Corleone, and looks like he's not going to play. That's a guy that you don't think a defensive lineman worth too much of the point spread, but I think he's worth at least a half point or a point. And
a team like that too.
Yeah,
a team like that, and when I'm talking about a conference that the margins are going to be so small. I'll just say this. I'm a little bit more. I'm on the pessimistic side on Cincinnati. Everybody's giving me all this optimism on all these teams in this conference. Somebody's got to lose, folks. Last I checked, it was a 0-sum game.
Well, yeah. Maybe we have a couple of teams that we've identified that are going to do a lot of the losing in the Big 12, which gives us the segue into the best bet portion of the program. Before we get there, though, if you're not already following Payne on social media, encourage you to do so at Payne Insider. You can get Brad Powers on X as well at Brad Powers 7. I'm Todd Fuhrman. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And this is our portion of the program where we appeal to all of your sensibilities. Go rate, review, subscribe if you haven't already done so to Bet the Board. Offer up a positive 5-star review. We know you love these previews. We do a lot of the heavy lifting to try and help all of you guys and girls out there that have busy lives and don't have a chance to comb through the transfer portals and the annuals on a regular basis. But all of that build us takes us to that best bet. And if we're staying in the Big 12, Payne, you tipped your hand a little bit about a team that we haven't mentioned so far in this show. It only gives us a couple of options, my friend, so the floor is yours.
So we were debating 2 of these teams going under, and effectively what transpired last night is I sent Brad my list of options. He fired his list of options back. I then sent you the list of options. You sent yours back. And this is one that all 3 of us have bet under. I still think there's value there. The schedule is just extremely difficult. I think we like Willie Fritz as a lead man long term, but it's a tough road in year one. We did see him struggle in year one at Tulane as well. There's still 4.5 out there. So let's go Houston under 4.5 minus 175 on that number. I'll tell you, I'm looking at our numbers right now. We're at like 3.12 here. So there is still some value here on Houston's under. Brad, you probably deal with, I would say you're more in tune with adhering to your numbers more than potentially I am, but it looks like you have some room still left on this Houston total as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm at 3.2. So, I mean, obviously, when you're talking just a half win's worth 70-some cents, I mean, we're talking, more than a full win difference. So, I would say, I bet over 100 season win totals. One of my favorite bets, and the one that I bet multiple times at different juice levels, Houston under 4.5. So, I love it. Rubber stamp it. I echo the sentiments. Love the Fritz hire long term. Just obviously one of the reasons Holgerson was fired, they did not recruit at a decent level for competitive depth in a tough Big 12. Oklahoma non-conference, plus 2 very dangerous group of 5 teams, non-conference, and UNLV and Rice that aren't slam dunks. I mean, they are going to be a short favorite in 2 games, UNLV Rice. And again, I mean, we're talking short favorites there, and then an underdog in the remaining 10 games. So I do not see a pathway to 5 wins. I would be stunned.
May make all of us here in Bet the Board country the biggest Rice Owls fans out there for week 3 being a swing game. Because to your point, Brad, if Houston can't win that game, just don't see a path for them once they get into the meat and potatoes of their conference schedule for them to go about getting some of those results, especially with one of the weaker opponents they'll face at the end of the year, Baylor at home, and then BYU, they have to go on the road. Going into Provo in late November, probably not exactly where you want to spend your holidays if your kid's hailing from the South in a season that could take a little while for Houston to build this program back into what it was a handful, if not longer, ago in terms of fighting for some of those top-tier bowl games that are out there. Gentlemen, fine job as always. The Big 12 officially done and dusted. 2 Power 4 conferences to go, the behemoths of all of them in the Big Ten and the SEC. And Brad, I'm going to ask you one final question before we bid our listeners a fond farewell. If I look at the Big 12 from top to bottom, suffice to say this is a one-bid league when we look at the landscape of the 12-team college football playoff this year?
Agree. And that one bid team could have 3 losses. So where does that put you? You might want to be the 5 seed in this year's college football playoff, playing the 4 seed Big 12 team.
Be careful what you wish for, Brad. Notre Dame going on the road to Stillwater for a neutral site for a playoff
Yeah, neutral.
game.
You want to be the 5 seed.
True. That is a very good point. As long as you finish that 5 spot, you get the group of 5 opponent. You don't want to finish the 6 and maybe get that 4th seeded team coming from the SEC. But plenty of playoff discussion on the horizon, no doubt, as we get to the 2 biggest leagues and the ones poised to make the biggest impact on this newly expanded college football playoff. Thanks to all of you guys and girls for tuning in for 2.5 hours of Big 12 glory. And most importantly, with a Houston Cougars regular season win total ticket in hand under the total, come hopefully early November. We'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.